It began with a town folded into the Ardennes like a secret the forest had been keeping for centuries. Clervaux sat low in a narrow valley, its stone buildings clustered beside a slow river, its medieval castle rising above rooftops like a silent witness to older wars. In winter, the town felt withdrawn from the world. Snow softened its edges, fog lingered between hills, church bells echoed longer than they should have. It was the kind of place where history usually passed by quietly, but in December of 1944, history did not pass by Clervaux. It crashed into it. The Ardennes was supposed to be calm, a resting sector, a quiet front, a place where exhausted American units could recover while the war moved elsewhere. Clervaux existed inside that assumption. American soldiers patrolled frozen roads believing the worst fighting was behind them. They warmed their hands near stoves, wrote letters home, repaired equipment worn thin by months of combat. Snow fell steadily, muting sound, making the world feel smaller and slower. The valley felt safe enough to forget how fragile safety could be. But beyond the ridgelines, the forest was awake. German forces gathered in silence, assembling one of the most ambitious counteroffensives of the war. Armor hid beneath pine branches. Infantry moved by night. Orders were whispered. Engines were kept cold until the last possible moment. The goal was speed, surprise, and shock, to smash through the Ardennes, split the Allied front, and force a negotiation that could change the course of the war. Clervaux stood directly in the path of that gamble. When the offensive began, it did not announce itself politely. Artillery fire shattered the morning stillness, echoing violently off valley walls. Shells slammed into American positions, collapsing roads and shattering trees into splinters. Snow erupted into gray clouds. Communication lines snapped. Confusion spread faster than orders could be given. German armor surged forward through the forest, tanks grinding over icy roads too narrow for retreat. Infantry followed close behind, moving with urgency born from long preparation. They poured into the valley from multiple directions, descending on Clervaux with a force no one there had expected. For the Americans inside the town, the shock was immediate. Units were outnumbered. Heavy weapons were scarce. Reinforcements were far away. Escape routes narrowed by the hour. And yet, they did not run. Small groups took positions inside stone buildings, behind walls thick enough to stop small arms fire, but never designed to withstand sustained assault. Machine guns were set up in windows overlooking narrow streets. Rifles cracked from doorways. Bazooka teams waited at intersections where tanks might appear. The castle itself became a focal point, its old walls pressed back into service against modern war. The fight for Clervaux became intimate and brutal. German tanks rolled into the streets, their engines echoing between buildings, their guns firing point-blank into strong points that refused to fall. Infantry advanced through alleys choked with rubble. Grenades exploded inside rooms that had once held families, not soldiers. Smoke filled stairwells. Fire spread from house to house, lighting the winter sky with a dull orange glow reflected off falling snow. American defenders fought not for victory, but for time. Every hour they held delayed the German advance. Every street contested slowed armored columns. Every building defended bought space for others farther west. They knew they were surrounded. They knew relief might never come. They fought anyway. The cold was relentless. Wounded men lay on frozen floors. Ammunition ran low. Radios crackled with fragments of desperate messages. Outside, German commanders pressed harder, frustrated by resistance they had not planned for. Tanks maneuvered awkwardly in streets never meant for them. The valley trapped noise and smoke, turning Clervaux into a bowl of chaos. By the time the resistance finally collapsed, the town was nearly destroyed. The castle stood scarred and burning. Houses lay open to the sky. The river carried debris past shattered bridges. Snow fell again, settling gently over destruction that still radiated heat. Clervaux had fallen, but it had not fallen easily. The delay inflicted there rippled outward across the Ardennes. German timetables slipped, fuel was burned, momentum slowed. What was meant to be a rapid thrust became a grinding advance haunted by unexpected resistance. A small town had forced a powerful army to bleed time it could not afford to lose. The Battle of Clervaux was not large in scale. It did not decide the war by itself. But it mattered, deeply. It showed how determination could stand against momentum, how geography could trap ambition, how ordinary soldiers, isolated and overwhelmed, could still shape events far beyond their immediate surroundings. Tonight, we return to that narrow valley, to the frozen streets where tanks advanced under fire, to the castle walls pressed into one last stand, to the soldiers who fought, knowing the odds, and chose to fight anyway, to Clervaux, a quiet place that became loud with history. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something calm and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? Is it late and still where you are, or does the night feel unfinished? And something deeper, unique to this episode. The Battle of Clervaux reminds us that sometimes standing firm is not about winning, but about buying time for something greater to survive. In your own life, has there been a moment when holding on, even briefly, mattered more than the outcome? If it feels right, share what that moment taught you. And if these long, slow journeys into the overlooked moments of history help your breathing slow, your thoughts settle, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. December 10th, 1944. Colonel Hurley Fuller stood in the tower of Clervaux Castle, watching the sun sink behind the wooded hills of Luxembourg, painting the Clervaux River Valley in shades of amber and shadow. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he surveyed the 5 roads that converged below him, like arteries leading to a heart. The medieval fortress beneath his boots had stood for 8 centuries, weathering sieges and storms, but Fuller knew it had never faced what was coming. He didn't know when, exactly. He didn't know the full scale of what gathered in the darkness beyond the German border, just 3 miles east across the Our River. But he knew with the certainty that comes from 20 years of soldiering that this quiet sector, this so-called ghost front, where American boys lounged in Luxembourg homes, drinking coffee and writing letters home, was about to explode. The castle commanded a view that military engineers would kill for, a natural fortress position overlooking the only practical routes west through this rugged terrain. Yet Fuller commanded just 3,000 men to defend 25 miles of forested hills and narrow valleys. The absurdity of his situation would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. Standard defensive doctrine, the kind taught at West Point and verified in blood across North Africa and France, called for 1 battalion per mile of front in static defense. Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment was stretched so thin that each of his men was theoretically responsible for defending 44 feet of Belgian-German border. His regiment had just rotated here from the Hurtgen Forest, that green hell of shattered trees and frozen mud, where the 28th Infantry Division had lost 6,184 men in 3 weeks of fighting that accomplished almost nothing. The Pennsylvania National Guard Division needed rest, needed replacements, needed time to remember what their rifles felt like when they weren't slick with freezing rain and blood. So, the generals had sent them here, to the quiet sector, to what the intelligence reports called a backwater, where the Germans were too weak to attack and too cautious to probe. Fuller had read those reports. He had walked the ground. And every instinct honed through campaigns from North Africa to Normandy screamed that the intelligence was catastrophically wrong. He descended the winding stone stairs of the castle tower, his boots echoing in passages where medieval knights had once walked. The castle sat 1,600 feet above sea level, a commanding height that gave artillery observers clear views across the entire valley system. Route 18 ran directly through Clervaux, the main north-south artery. Route 17 intersected it, heading west toward Bastogne, that critical crossroads town 18 miles away where 7 roads met. Anyone wanting to punch through the Ardennes toward the Meuse River and beyond to Antwerp would have to come through here or take such a circuitous route that their offensive would lose all momentum. Fuller had tried explaining this to division headquarters, had pointed at maps until his finger ached, had submitted report after report detailing how Clervaux was not a backwater, but a cork in a bottle. The responses he received were polite, professional, and utterly dismissive. The Ghost Front was quiet because the Germans were beaten, because they lacked the fuel and reserves for major operations, because the war was effectively won even if the fighting dragged on. Fuller hoped they were right. He didn't believe they were. That evening, Fuller met with his staff in a commandeered hotel that served as regimental headquarters. Major James Hughes spread maps across a table, still covered with the tablecloth, from its previous civilian life, incongruously cheerful fabric decorated with flowers. They reviewed the dispositions, though Fuller could recite them from memory. Company B held positions north of Marnock, 2 miles from Clervaux, anchoring that approach. Company C covered the center. Company K defended Hosingen to the northeast, 3 miles away across forested ridges. Each company, under strength after Hurtgen, numbered perhaps 150 men, instead of the authorized 193. Each had a few anti-tank guns, bazookas, and mortars. Each occupied positions that hadn't been prepared by engineers, just hastily dug foxholes and a few sandbagged machine gun nests. If the Germans came in force, these companies would serve as tripwires, delaying actions designed to buy time for reinforcements to arrive and establish a proper defensive line. The problem, as Fuller saw it with crystalline clarity, was that there were no reinforcements. Division had committed its reserves to other sectors. Corps headquarters was focused on the offensive everyone expected to launch in spring. The entire American command structure in this theater was oriented toward attack, toward the push into Germany, toward ending the war by Christmas, or at worst by spring. Nobody was thinking about defense except Fuller, standing in a castle tower watching the darkness gather. The civilian population of Clervaux numbered about 1,800 souls, Luxembourg citizens who spoke a German dialect, but whose loyalties were unquestionably opposed to the Nazi regime that had occupied their country from 1940 to 1944. They had welcomed the Americans as liberators in September, had opened their homes, shared their dwindling food supplies, treated the GIs like the heroes they were supposed to be. Now those same civilians went about their business with a forced normalcy that Fuller found heartbreaking. Women hung laundry in December cold. Children played in streets where Sherman tanks were parked at intersections. Shopkeepers kept irregular hours, their shelves nearly empty, but their doors open as acts of defiance against the possibility of return to German rule. Fuller had tried to convince the mayor to organize an evacuation, to get the vulnerable citizens moving west while the roads were still clear. The mayor had listened politely and done nothing, because where would they go, and on what authority would they abandon their homes? And wasn't the war nearly over anyway? So they stayed, ordinary people living in the shadow of a castle, trusting that the Americans who had freed them once would protect them now. On the evening of December 15th, something changed. Henri Weyrich appeared at regimental headquarters just after sunset. A Luxembourg resistance member who worked as a clerk in the civilian administration, but whose real job involved watching, listening, and reporting. Fuller trusted Weyrich more than he trusted half the intelligence summaries that came down from division. The man had survived 4 years of German occupation by being observant, careful, and accurate. Now he sat across from Fuller in a small office, speaking in accented but precise English about what he had seen and heard. German trucks moving at night on the far side of the Aar River, their headlights blacked out but their engines audible in the cold air that carried sound for miles. Civilians in German-held villages being forcibly evacuated, pushed east away from the border. Unusual radio traffic, Weyrich's cousin, who worked for a German postal official, reported, coded messages, and routing changes. Most tellingly, the small-scale patrolling and reconnaissance that usually characterized this sector had stopped completely. The Germans had gone silent. The forest across the river was still. Weyrich leaned forward, his weathered face serious. In his experience, he said quietly, the Germans only went silent when they were preparing to scream. Fuller thanked Weyrich and sent the report up to division headquarters, flagging it as urgent. He didn't expect much response, and he wasn't disappointed. The reply came back within hours, a tersely professional assessment that attributed the activity to normal troop rotations and winter quartering. The Germans were probably pulling units back from the line to rest, consolidating for the defensive battles they would fight as American armies pushed into the fatherland. There was no intelligence indicating offensive preparations, no identified reserves, no strategic objective that would justify a major attack in this sector. Fuller was advised to maintain normal vigilance, but not to alarm the civilian population with unfounded concerns. He read the message twice, then filed it carefully. Then he called his company commanders and told them to sleep in their boots, to keep ammunition unpacked and ready, to make sure their men knew where their weapons were in the dark. He didn't tell them why because he couldn't articulate it in a way that wouldn't sound like paranoia. He just told them to be ready. That night, Fuller walked through Clervaux one final time before the world changed. The medieval town huddled against winter cold. Stone buildings with steep roofs built to shed snow, narrow streets that had never been designed for tanks but now accommodated them awkwardly. He stopped at the church, a structure almost as old as the castle itself, and stood in the empty nave listening to the silence. He had never been a particularly religious man, but he found himself offering something between a prayer and a promise to whatever might be listening. If it came to fighting here, in these streets with these civilians, he would do everything in his power to protect them. He would hold this town as long as humanly possible. He would make the Germans pay for every yard in blood and time. It wasn't much of a prayer, more like a contract signed in the dark. But it steadied him. He walked back to the castle, climbed to his quarters in one of the restored chambers, and lay down fully clothed with his boots on. He didn't sleep well, he never did any more, but he rested and he waited. And in the darkness beyond the river, 20 divisions of German armor and infantry made their final preparations for the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. The strategic situation that made Clervaux critically important was one that existed more on maps than in the minds of the senior Allied command. The Ardennes region, covering parts of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany, was considered unsuitable for major armored operations. The terrain was too broken, too forested, too laced with rivers and steep valleys. Tanks needed open ground to maneuver, clear sight lines to engage, good roads to sustain logistics. The Ardennes had narrow tracks, dense woods, and defensible river lines. It was the same reasoning that had led the French to lightly garrison this sector in 1940, and everyone knew how that had worked out when Guderian's panzers had come screaming through. But institutional memory is short, and the current American assessment was that the Germans simply lacked the resources for a major offensive anywhere, let alone through terrain that would negate their remaining advantages. So, the Ardennes became a quiet sector, a place to rest battered divisions and blood-green troops, a 90-mile stretch of front held by fewer divisions than doctrine required because nothing important ever happened there. Fuller understood terrain in a way that staff officers studying maps in warm headquarters did not. He had walked every mile of his sector, had stood in every valley and looked up at the commanding heights, had driven the roads and tested the bridges. Clervaux was not just another town. It was the hinge on which any offensive through this sector would swing. The Clervaux River, though not particularly wide or deep, ran through a valley with steep sides that channeled movement onto a handful of bridges and fords. The roads converged here because geography dictated they must. A tank column could bypass individual strong points, race past small villages, ignore isolated resistance. But it could not bypass Clervaux without adding hours or even days to its advance, without stretching supply lines to the breaking point, without exposing flanks to counterattack. The town was a natural choke point, and the castle was its guardian. Fuller, standing in that tower on December 10th, understood this with perfect clarity. The Germans, preparing their offensive with meticulous care, understood it too. What neither side yet knew was how much those 36 to 40 hours of delay would ultimately cost, and how many lives would be traded for time measured not in days but in minutes. November 25, 1944. Deep in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's eastern headquarters complex hidden in the forests of East Prussia, a room full of generals listened in stunned silence as their Führer outlined a plan they considered insane. The war was lost. Any rational analysis concluded. The Red Army was crushing through Poland. The Western Allies held France and were preparing to cross the Rhine. Germany's cities burned under round-the-clock bombing. Fuel reserves were critically low. Trained replacements were nearly exhausted. The logic of mathematics and materiel suggested negotiation, retreat, managed collapse. Hitler proposed the opposite, a massive offensive through the Ardennes, splitting the British and American armies, racing to Antwerp to capture the port that sustained Allied logistics, creating a catastrophe that would force the Western Allies to negotiate and free German forces to face the Soviets. The generals listened, calculated, and privately despaired. Then they saluted and began planning how to accomplish the impossible. The offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, represented Hitler's last grasp at strategic initiative. The plan called for 3 armies to smash through the thinly held Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, and drive for Antwerp, covering over 100 miles in less than a week. 29 divisions, including 10 armored divisions, would strike an 80-mile front held by 4.5 American divisions. The math was simple and brutal. The attackers would enjoy better than 5-to-1 superiority in infantry, overwhelming advantages in armor and artillery. If they achieved surprise, if the Americans were truly as scattered and unprepared as intelligence suggested, if the weather stayed bad enough to ground Allied air power, if captured fuel dumps could sustain the advance, if all the ifs aligned, they might actually reach the Meuse. After that, improvisation and audacity would have to suffice. The plan was desperate. It was also the only plan that offered anything other than slow, grinding defeat. Generaloberst Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, received the operational plan with the grim professionalism of a man who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He knew desperation when he saw it, but he also knew how to execute orders. His staff began the intricate work of assembling forces, stockpiling ammunition, identifying routes, all while maintaining absolute radio silence and conducting elaborate deception operations to convince Allied intelligence that the buildup was purely defensive. The Allies were looking for German reserves, yes, but they expected to find them opposite Montgomery in the north or Patton in the south, where the obvious offensive threats existed. Nobody expected a major attack through terrain the Allies themselves considered unsuitable for armored operations. Model, studying the maps, identified the critical terrain features that would determine success or failure. The Our River had to be crossed quickly on improvised bridges. The Clervaux River Valley had to be breached before American reinforcements could seal it. Bastogne had to be neutralized or bypassed, and the Meuse had to be reached within 48 hours before American reserves could be repositioned. Every hour of delay would narrow the already slim chances of success. The spearhead formations represented the best remaining offensive capability in the German army. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein's Panzerlehr Division would attack in the southern sector, aimed directly at Clervaux and then Bastogne. Panzerlehr was a reconstituted elite formation, rebuilt after its destruction in Normandy with a corps of veteran tankers and officers. It fielded approximately 13,000 men, 57 Panther tanks with their excellent long-barrel 75mm guns, 30 older Panzer Mark IV medium tanks, and supporting infantry in half-tracks. In theory, this was enough combat power to shatter several American battalions and race into the Allied rear. In practice, Bayerlein knew his division was a shadow of its former strength, manned partly by teenage conscripts and recovering wounded, short on fuel and spare parts. Operationally capable, but not the juggernaut the plan required. Still, compared to what the Americans had directly in his path, Panzerlehr was overwhelming force. Colonel Meinrad von Lauchert's 2nd Panzer Division would attack north of Panzerlehr, following parallel routes toward the same objectives. 2nd Panzer had more combat experience but fewer tanks, its operational vehicles numbering in the dozens rather than scores after months of attrition fighting. The plan called for these armored spearheads to punch through on narrow roads, bypass strong points where possible, leave infantry to mop up resistance, and just keep moving west. Speed was everything. The plan's timetable allowed no time for set-piece battles or methodical reduction of defended positions. Get across the Our River by H hour plus 6 hours. Reach Clervaux by H hour plus 12 hours. Be through the Clervaux Valley and approaching Bastogne by end of day 1. These weren't goals, they were requirements. Miss them by even a few hours, and the geometric progression of delays would doom the entire offensive. Every staff officer calculating logistics and movement rates understood this. Every tank commander briefed on the operation understood this. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't know, was that a handful of American companies armed with rifles and a few anti-tank guns, led by officers who refused to abandon positions because they had orders to hold, would make accomplishing that timetable mathematically impossible. Throughout early December, the Germans moved into position with extraordinary discipline. Tanks rolled forward only at night, their engines muffled, their tracks following carefully prepared routes. Infantry marched in darkness, forbidden to sing or smoke. Artillery pieces were positioned in woods and covered with camouflage netting. Fuel trucks were hidden in barns. Ammunition dumps were dispersed and concealed. Radio communications were forbidden, except for essential coded messages. German units had become expert at hiding after 5 years of war against enemies with air superiority, but this level of operational security was unusual even by their standards. Allied aerial reconnaissance photographed the sector repeatedly, but saw nothing alarming, just the normal defensive positions and routine logistics of a quiet front. Allied intelligence, firmly convinced that German offensive capability had been destroyed in France, interpreted every data point through that lens. Increased traffic meant defensive repositioning. Troop concentrations meant rest areas. The buildup that should have screamed impending attack instead whispered routine winter quartering. On December 15th, the final orders were distributed to assault units. Officers gathered their men in barns and cellars, spread maps, explained objectives. The men of Panzerlehr Division, huddled in cold Belgian villages just across the German border, learned that they would attack at 0530 hours on December 16th. Their objective was to cross the Our River at Gemund, advance through Clervaux, and reach Bastogne by nightfall. Bayerlein, addressing his officers, was characteristically blunt. They were outnumbered strategically, but would achieve local superiority through surprise. The Americans were strung thin, demoralized after Hürtgen Forest, not expecting attack. Speed would be their weapon. Every hour saved was worth more than any tactical victory. Clervaux must fall by noon. Bastogne by dark. The Meuse within 48 hours. Questions were asked about fuel. Bayerlein's answer was coldly practical. They carried enough fuel for 100 kilometers. After that, they would capture American dumps or run dry. There was no alternative supply plan because there was no supply to plan with. Germany's fuel reserves were exhausted. This offensive would run on captured supplies or not run at all. The psychological state of German soldiers preparing for this attack varied wildly. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived Stalingrad or Kursk, saw this offensive with clear eyes. It was desperate, dangerous, probably doomed, but at least it was action instead of slow retreat. Younger soldiers, many in their first combat operation, absorbed the propaganda about wonder weapons and final victory with varying degrees of belief. Officers understood the strategic situation but chose to focus on immediate tactical objectives because thinking too far ahead led to paralysis. The common thread binding them was professionalism and a kind of fatalistic determination. They were soldiers. They had orders. They would execute those orders with maximum aggression and see what resulted. Some prayed for miracle, some prayed for survival. Most just checked their weapons, ate their rations, and tried to sleep a few hours before the artillery barrage that would announce the last great German offensive in the West. The fuel situation deserves particular emphasis because it would prove decisive. German tanks were powerful but fuel-hungry machines. A Panther tank consumed approximately 2 gallons per mile in cross-country movement, more when fighting. 2nd Panzer Division's operational tanks, numbering perhaps 60 vehicles, would collectively burn thousands of gallons, reaching objectives that were dozens of miles away. Fuel trucks following the combat formations would themselves consume fuel moving forward. The mathematics were brutal and unyielding. German planners had calculated minimum fuel requirements and then shaved those estimates to dangerous minimums. They planned to capture American fuel dumps at specific locations on specific timetables. If those dumps weren't captured on schedule, if the advance bogged down even slightly, if tanks had to maneuver more than planned or fight longer than expected, the entire mechanized force would simply run dry and die in place. This wasn't a theoretical concern. This was the iron law of logistics that had broken every German offensive since Stalingrad. The only answer was speed. Reach objectives faster than the enemy could react. Overrun supply dumps before they could be destroyed. Keep moving forward no matter what, because stopping meant death. On the night of December 15th to 16th, the temperature dropped below freezing, and fog settled into the valleys of the Ardennes. German assault troops huddled in their positions, whispering final checks, synchronizing watches, waiting for the artillery barrage that would begin at 0530 hours. Across the Our River, American soldiers of the 110th Infantry Regiment, slept in farmhouses and foxholes, their commanders uneasy, but their troops relaxed in the routine of a quiet sector. The distance between these two armies was less than 3 miles of forested hills. The gap in awareness was infinite. The Germans knew what was coming and had prepared with everything they had left. The Americans had warnings they hadn't believed and defenses they hadn't completed. In a few hours, those 3 miles would become the most contested ground on Earth, and a medieval castle overlooking a river valley would become the fulcrum on which the entire German offensive would begin its fatal delay. December 16, 1944, 05:29 hours. Private First Class Robert Brewer, 3rd Squad, 1st Platoon, Company B, 110th Infantry Regiment, was dreaming of home when the world ended. He was 19 years old, a farm boy from Pennsylvania who had been in the Army for 18 months and combat for exactly 63 days. He was dreaming about his mother's kitchen, the specific yellow warmth of lamplight on linoleum, when the first German artillery shell detonated 200 yards from his forward observation bunker overlooking the Our River. The sound was beyond sound, a physical force that slammed through earth and air and bone. Before his conscious mind could process what was happening, before he could fully wake, the barrage intensified into something that redefined his understanding of violence. 1,600 German artillery pieces fired, in near-perfect synchronization, across an 80-mile front. The mathematics of that statement obscure its reality. 1,600 guns meant 1,600 shells every minute at minimum rate of fire, 960,000 pounds of high explosive and steel fragmenting across American positions every 60 seconds. The noise transcended hearing. It became a pressure that squeezed thought from the skull. Brewer's bunker was a crude affair, logs and sandbags built into a hillside overlooking the Our River crossing at Gmünd. Company B occupied a string of such positions, a thin defensive line that was supposed to provide early warning of German activity. The company numbered 143 men that morning, scattered across 2 miles of forested ridgeline, in squad and platoon positions that had no mutual support, because there weren't enough men to create a continuous line. Brewer's squad, 8 men in 2 bunkers, was responsible for observing a quarter-mile of river frontage and reporting any crossing attempts. They had a sound-powered telephone connected to company headquarters 3 miles back in Marnock. They had rifles, 1 Browning automatic rifle, and a single 60mm mortar with 12 rounds. Against reconnaissance patrols or small-scale probes, they were adequate. Against what was coming, they were a speed bump. The barrage lasted 90 minutes in Brewer's sector, though he would later have no clear memory of time passing. His universe contracted to the log ceiling of his bunker, shaking loose dirt with each impact, to the faces of his squad mates illuminated by flashes visible through the firing slit, to the realization that they couldn't run because running meant dying, and staying meant probably dying, but at least with cover. At 0600 hours, the barrage shifted. Instead of impacting randomly across the American positions, the shells began falling in a creeping pattern, marching west away from the river. This was the signal. German assault troops rose from positions on the east bank of the Our River and began crossing on improvised bridges that combat engineers had assembled under cover of darkness. These weren't proper military bridges, but rough structures of logs and planking, capable of bearing infantry and light vehicles, but requiring careful crossing. Behind them, heavier bridges were being constructed for the tanks that would follow. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, a roughly trained infantry formation built from a cadre of veterans and a mass of teenage conscripts, had the mission of forcing the crossings and creating bridgeheads. They moved with the jerky intensity of men who knew that survival meant closing the distance with the enemy as quickly as possible. Brewer, looking through his bunker firing slit as the barrage lifted, saw a sight that would feature in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Hundreds of figures in field gray uniforms emerging from the pre-dawn darkness, moving in practiced fire team rushes, their weapons already firing at anything that might conceal an American position. The telephone to company headquarters was dead, the wire cut by artillery. Brewer's corporal made the decision to hold their position and use the signal rockets they carried to alert units to their rear. The squad opened fire at ranges under 100 yards, the Bayar cutting down the first German squad to approach their position. For perhaps 10 minutes they held, expending ammunition at a rate that would exhaust their supply in under an hour. Then, German machine guns, set up with professional efficiency, began suppressing the American bunker with grazing fire that made it suicidal to expose oneself at the firing slit. Mortars began impacting with precision that suggested forward observers had identified their exact position. The corporal made the second decision of the morning, the one that would save most of their lives. They would withdraw while they still could, fall back to Marnock where the company was supposed to consolidate, live to fight from a position that wasn't already zeroed by German artillery. They left everything they couldn't carry in 60 seconds, scrambled out the back of the bunker into darkness and fog, and ran west through forests where every tree might conceal a German rifleman. In Clervaux, 12 miles west of where Brewer was running for his life, Colonel Fuller was trying to make sense of fragmentary and contradictory reports. The first word of the attack had come at 0545, a frantic telephone call from a forward observer reporting massive artillery fire. Then the calls had cascaded, each one describing attacks in a different sector, each one more urgent than the last. By 0630, Fuller understood he was facing a coordinated offensive across his entire front, but he didn't yet understand the scale. Were these probing attacks? A limited offensive to improve German defensive positions? The prelude to something larger? He sent runners to his companies with orders to hold their positions, assess the attack, and report in detail. He radioed 28th Division headquarters requesting clarification and reinforcements. He walked to the castle tower and looked east, where the sky was growing lighter with dawn and darker with smoke from burning villages. The sound of artillery was continuous, a rumble like distant thunder that never stopped. His executive officer, Major Hughes, joined him in the tower, with a map marked with red symbols showing reported German activity. Every position along the Aar River was under attack. The Germans were crossing at multiple points. The scale suggested at least a division-level assault, possibly more. The civilian population of Clervaux was waking to sounds they hadn't heard since 1944, when retreating German forces had fought, delaying actions against advancing American columns. Marie-Paul Meyerus, a schoolteacher who lived in a narrow stone house near the church, stood in her doorway listening to the distant artillery and watching American soldiers running through the streets with the purposeful urgency that meant something serious was happening. Her neighbors emerged, asking questions in Luxembourgish and French and broken English, demanding to know if they should evacuate, if the Germans were coming back, if this was real or just an exercise. Nobody had answers. American soldiers were taking up positions at street corners, unloading ammunition crates from trucks, stringing telephone wire. An officer she didn't recognize told her in passable French to stay indoors, keep away from windows, prepare her cellar for possible occupation. The tone was professional, but the underlying message was clear. This was not an exercise. She returned inside, descended to her cellar, and began clearing space among the stored preserves and old furniture, creating a shelter that would soon house 30 civilians through weeks of combat. By 0700 hours, Fuller had enough information to understand that this was no local attack. Every one of his forward companies was engaged. The Germans had crossed the Aar River at multiple points and were advancing west with what sounded like armor support. His telephone rang with increasing desperation. Company B was falling back from its forward positions under heavy pressure. Company K at Hosingen reported being surrounded, but still holding the village. Company C had lost contact with its forward platoons. The roadblock positions, those hastily established strong points that were supposed to channel German movement onto killing grounds, were being overwhelmed or bypassed. Fuller made the calculations that every commander dreads. He had perhaps 2,000 men en route. Immediate defensive positions, scattered across 25 miles. He was facing what intelligence now estimated at division-strength assault, maybe 15,000 Germans with armor support. The math was simple and awful. He couldn't hold everywhere. He had to decide where to concentrate his limited forces, which positions to reinforce and which to abandon. Every choice meant condemning some of his men to fight isolated actions against overwhelming force. The weather that morning was miserable and, for the Germans, perfect. Heavy fog reduced visibility to under 200 yards in the valleys. The cloud ceiling was below 200 feet, making air support impossible. American artillery could fire but couldn't see targets except when called in by forward observers, most of whom were dead or running. The fog also concealed German movement, allowing infiltration and flanking maneuvers that would have been suicidal in clear weather. German commanders had planned the offensive timing to exploit this weather window, when forecasts predicted several days of conditions that would ground the Allied air forces that had made German daytime movement a death sentence since Normandy. Now that bet was paying off. Panther tanks could move down roads in daylight without fear of fighter-bomber attack. Supply columns could advance without being strafed. The advantage this conferred was difficult to quantify, but decisive in its impact. American forces in the Ardennes had built their defensive assumptions around the certainty of air support. Take that away, and the correlation of forces shifted dramatically in Germany's favor. By 0800 hours, the 1st German armor was approaching Marnock, where Company B had fallen back to establish a defensive position. The village sat at a critical road junction 2 miles north of Clervaux, controlling one of the main approach routes. Captain James Mackey, Company B commander, had approximately 100 men in Marnock, reinforced by survivors from forward positions and a platoon of combat engineers who happened to be in the village working on bridge repairs. Against them came the reconnaissance battalion of 2nd Panzer Division, roughly 400 men supported by a dozen armored cars and half-tracks. The Germans expected to drive through Marnock in 15 minutes, brush aside whatever token resistance they encountered, and continue west. What they got instead was a meat grinder. Mackey had positioned his 2 57mm anti-tank guns with overlapping fields of fire covering the main road. When the first German armored car entered the village at 08:15, both guns fired simultaneously from ranges under 100 yards. The car exploded. The column behind it, trapped on the narrow road with buildings on both sides, couldn't maneuver or retreat without exposing flanks and rear armor. For the next 2 hours, Marnock became an urban battlefield where American riflemen fired from cellars and upper windows, while German infantry tried to clear buildings room by room. Every minute that passed was another minute. The German timetable slipped, another gallon of fuel burned by idling tanks waiting for the road to clear. The sound of battle reached Clervaux as a continuous background roar, punctuated by the sharp crack of tank guns and the chatter of automatic weapons. Fuller stood in the castle command post, phone in hand, listening to Mackey's calm voice reporting that Marnock was under heavy attack but still holding. How long could he hold? Mackey didn't know. How many Germans? At least a battalion, maybe more, definitely armor. Did he need reinforcements? Yes, but only if Fuller had them to spare, and Mackey knew Fuller didn't. The conversation was professional. 2 officers discussing an impossible situation with the detachment that comes from recognizing that emotion won't change mathematics. Fuller told Mackey to hold as long as possible, then withdraw if encircled. Mackey acknowledged, and the line went dead. Fuller turned to his staff and gave orders that committed his last reserves. Headquarters Company, 200 men who were clerks and drivers and cooks, would form a provisional rifle company. They would move north toward Marnock with the 5 Sherman tanks that constituted his entire armored reserve. Maybe they could relieve the pressure. Maybe they could buy a few more hours. Fuller didn't say what everyone in the room understood. He was sending men with minimal combat training to fight veteran panzer divisions in a delaying action that would probably annihilate them. 0900 hours, December 16th. Lieutenant Raymond Flagg of Company B stood behind a 57mm anti-tank gun positioned at the northern edge of Marnock, watching German tanks approach through fog that reduced them to dark shapes emerging from gray nothing. He was 23 years old, a ROTC graduate from a Pennsylvania college who had been in command of this platoon for 6 weeks. His gun crew consisted of 5 men, 3 of whom had never fired their weapon at an actual enemy before this morning. The 57mm gun was a capable piece of equipment against the German Panzer Mark IV medium tank, able to penetrate its frontal armor at ranges under 500 yards with the new tungsten core ammunition they'd received last month. Against the Panther tank, with its sloped armor and high-velocity 75mm gun, the American weapon was marginal at best, capable of killing only with side or rear shots. The vehicle approaching through the fog, identifiable by its distinctive long barrel and low profile, was a Panther. Flagg led it close to 200 yards, praying his crew wouldn't panic and fire early, knowing that one shot was all they would get before the German tank identified their position and killed them. The mathematics of anti-tank combat are brutally simple and entirely unforgiving. The 57mm armor-piercing round weighed roughly 6 pounds and left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. Against the Panther's frontal armor, 100mm of face-hardened steel sloped at 55 degrees. It would likely bounce. Against the side armor, 40mm of less sloped plate, it would penetrate if the angle was favorable. Fleeg's gunner, Corporal Mike D'Angelo from the Bronx, had 3 seconds to aim. 3 seconds during which the Panther would move approximately 60 feet. 3 seconds during which being spotted meant instantaneous death from a German shell that could penetrate their gun shield like paper. D'Angelo fired. The recoil slammed the gun backward. The breech spat the spent casing with a metallic clang, and 200 yards away the Panther staggered sideways and stopped, smoke pouring from hatches. The crew had maybe 5 seconds to celebrate before they realized a dozen more Panthers were emerging from the fog behind the one they'd killed. The roadblock at Marnock had been established according to standard doctrine for defense against armored attack. The anti-tank guns were positioned to fire from defilade, protected by terrain from direct fire until they revealed themselves by shooting. Infantry and foxholes covered the approaches with rifle and machine gun fire to strip away German infantry support from the tanks. Bazookas provided close-range backup if tanks broke through. Mines would have been ideal, but there were no mines, the engineer dumps having been exhausted by other sectors and replacements not yet arrived. So, Fleeg's platoon held a position designed for a reinforced company, 40 men trying to do the work of 150, betting their lives that German doctrine would force the tanks to slow down and suppress infantry before advancing. That bet held for approximately 20 minutes. The German tanks, having identified the anti-tank gun positions, pulled back 200 yards and began systematically demolishing every building and hedgerow that might conceal an American soldier. The volume of fire was stunning, overwhelming, psychologically crushing. High explosive shells detonated in sequence, walking through the defensive position like a man stomping on anthills. Machine gun fire from vehicle-mounted weapons suppressed anything that moved. Mortars dropped rounds with precision that spoke to excellent forward observation. Captain Mackey, directing the defense of Marnock from a cellar command post, understood with perfect clarity that his company was being destroyed. He had started the morning with 143 men. He now estimated he had perhaps 90 effectives, the rest killed, wounded, or shell-shocked into immobility. German infantry was infiltrating through the smoke and fog, clearing buildings with grenades and automatic weapons, professional and efficient and utterly relentless. His radio crackled with reports from squad leaders, each one describing impossible situations that demanded immediate support he couldn't provide. Third squad was out of ammunition. First platoon's command bunker had taken a direct hit. The anti-tank gun on the east side was destroyed, crew dead. The coherent defensive plan he'd established at dawn was disintegrating into isolated pockets of resistance. Groups of men fighting separate battles with no coordination beyond staying alive. Mackey called Fuller at Clervaux, his voice steady despite everything. "They're all around us," he reported, "but we're still here." The delay imposed by Marnock's resistance was creating cascading problems for the German advance. 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion had expected to clear the village by 08:30 and advance to Clervaux by 1000 hours. Instead, it was approaching noon, and they were still fighting in Marnock. The main body of 2nd Panzer, heavy tanks and mechanized infantry, was stacked up behind the roadblock, burning fuel, losing time, commanders screaming into radios demanding to know why the advance had stalled. Colonel von Lauschert, division commander, faced a classic military dilemma. He could commit more force to Marnock, overwhelm the American defenders with mass, and clear the route. But that meant delaying the entire division while a single company was reduced. Or he could bypass Marnock, send his tanks cross-country around the village, and leave infantry to deal with the Americans. But the terrain wasn't favorable for off-road movement. The fog made navigation difficult, and leaving an enemy strong point in his rear violated doctrine and common sense. Every minute he spent deciding was another minute lost to the timetable. 3 miles northeast of Marnock, a similar drama was unfolding at Hosingen. Company K, commanded by Captain Clark Mackey, younger brother of James Mackey in Marnock, held this village with approximately 100 men. Hosingen sat on the northern approach route to Clervaux, controlling secondary roads that German forces would need if Marnock blocked the main avenue. At 0700, elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, roughly 1,500 men supported by assault guns, had surrounded the village and demanded surrender. Mackey's response was to direct artillery fire onto the German assembly areas, killing or wounding dozens and disrupting the planned assault. The Germans, furious and frustrated, settled into a methodical reduction of the strong point, bringing up heavy weapons and infantry assault teams. What should have been a one-hour battle became an all-day siege, Company K holding its positions through professionalism, stubbornness, and the advantage of fighting from prepared positions in stone buildings that required direct fire to destroy. The American soldiers holding these roadblocks were not elite troops or hardened veterans. They were citizen soldiers, National Guardsmen from Pennsylvania who had been in combat for 2 months, who had suffered through the Hurtgen Forest and desperately needed rest instead of another fight. What they had was training, leadership, and orders. The training told them how to position weapons, how to call for artillery, how to fight as a unit instead of as individuals. The leadership came from officers like Flegg and the Mackey brothers, men who stayed calm under fire and made decisions based on doctrine rather than panic. The orders were simple: hold, don't retreat without permission, delay the enemy as long as possible. Those orders, which might have seemed routine when issued in quiet sector, now acquired terrible significance. Holding meant dying. Delaying meant accepting casualties to buy time. The soldiers at Marnock and Hosingen understood this and held anyway, not from heroic impulse, but from the grinding discipline that makes men follow orders even when every instinct screams to run. By noon, on December 16th, Marnock was burning. German artillery had set most of the buildings ablaze, the wooden components of stone structures providing fuel for fires that spread despite the December cold. The civilians who hadn't evacuated sheltered in cellars, trapped between American defenders above them and German attackers outside. One such cellar held the Muller family, parents, 4 children, and elderly grandmother, huddled in darkness that strobed with each explosion, praying in Luxembourgish that the floor above wouldn't collapse. When a German stick grenade bounced down the cellar stairs, Mother Maria Muller threw herself on top of her children, expecting death. The grenade was a dud. Its detonator failed. She would remember that moment for the rest of her life, the shape of the grenade outlined against the cellar's dirt floor, the weight of her children beneath her body, the realization that she was still alive when she should have been torn apart. Lieutenant Flegg's 2nd Anti-Tank Gun Crew, positioned on the south side of Marnock, achieved something extraordinary at 12:15 hours. A Panther tank approached their position at an angle that exposed its thinner side armor. The loader, Private Howard Klein, had loaded an armor-piercing round and was reaching for another when the gunner fired without command. The round hit the Panther just behind the turret ring, penetrated into the fighting compartment, and detonated stored ammunition. The explosion blew the turret completely off the chassis, sending 30 tons of steel spinning 15 feet into the air before crashing down upside down. The crew survived long enough to realize what they'd done before a German machine gun position, vectoring on their muzzle flash, killed them all with a sustained burst. The destroyed Panther blocked the street, forcing German vehicles to maneuver around it, adding more minutes to the delay. Those minutes, purchased with American lives, were becoming the currency that would determine the entire offensive's outcome. Captain James Mackey, watching his company disintegrate, made the decision every commander dreads. At 1300 hours, he ordered withdrawal. The men of Company B, those who could still move and fight, would fall back from Marnock in squad groups, using smoke and covered routes, attempting to reach Clervaux where they could reorganize. It wasn't surrender, it was recognition that staying meant annihilation without further benefit. They had held for 7 hours against overwhelming force. They had killed dozens of Germans and destroyed perhaps 8 armored vehicles. Most importantly, they had delayed 2nd Panzer Division's entire advance by half a day. The timetable called for the panzers to reach Clervaux by noon. Instead, they were still fighting in Marnock at 1300, and the road ahead was still contested. Mackey led his surviving men west, moving through forests and farm tracks, losing more to German patrols and artillery, but getting most of them out. When he reached Clervaux that evening, he had 63 men left from the 143 he'd started with. Lieutenant Flagg wasn't among the survivors. His body was found in Marnock 3 weeks later, still behind his anti-tank gun, surrounded by spent shell casings. 1400 hours, December 16th, Clervaux Castle. Colonel Hurley Fuller stood in the command post that occupied what had once been a medieval great hall, now filled with radios, map tables, and young officers processing information that arrived in fragments and chaos. On the map before him, red marks indicated enemy contact across his entire 25-mile front. Every single one of his forward companies was engaged or had been overrun. The defensive line he'd carefully constructed existed only on paper. Reality was German panzers advancing down multiple roads, American units fighting isolated actions, communication networks failing as wire was cut, and radio operators died. Fuller had commanded troops in North Africa and Sicily, had seen combat in conditions ranging from desert to mountain. This was different. This was his regiment being methodically dismantled by force he couldn't match, and a plan he hadn't anticipated despite his misgivings. The question facing him wasn't whether to hold, but how to trade his men's lives for maximum delay. The telephone call from division headquarters came at 14:10. General Norman Cote, commanding the 28th Division, was a hands-on leader who believed in fighting forward. His orders to Fuller were unambiguous: hold Clervaux at all costs. No withdrawal without explicit division permission. The road net through Clervaux was too important to yield without extracting maximum German casualties and time. Reinforcements were being organized but wouldn't arrive for at least 24 hours, maybe longer. Corps was scrambling to identify reserves, but the Ardennes attack had caught higher headquarters as surprised as it had caught Fuller. For now, the 110th Infantry Regiment would hold with what it had. Fuller acknowledged the orders, his voice neutral, concealing the calculation he was making. At all costs was a phrase that sounded noble in conference rooms and meant death in the field. Costs would be measured in the lives of men who had families and futures and reasons to survive. Those costs would be paid regardless of whether Fuller thought them worthwhile. His job was to extract maximum value for the payment. Fuller's executive officer, Major Hughes, provided the accounting. The regiment had started the day with approximately 3,000 men in 12 rifle companies plus supporting elements. Current estimates suggested 1,500 effectives remaining in organized units. Another 500 scattered or cut off. The rest casualties or missing. Company B at Marnock was withdrawing after suffering 50% casualties. Company K at Hosingen was surrounded but still fighting. Companies along the Our River had effectively ceased to exist as organized units, survivors filtering back individually. The Regimental Reserve, Headquarters Company, was already committed to a counterattack toward Marnock with tank support. Fuller now had perhaps 800 men in Clervaux itself, a mix of regimental headquarters troops, support elements, and stragglers. Against them, intelligence estimated at least one German panzer division, possibly two, totaling 15,000 to 20,000 men with 100-plus tanks. The math was genocidal. The decision tree facing Fuller had no good branches. He could consolidate everyone in Clervaux, create a strong defensive position using the castle and town, and hold for perhaps 24 to 36 hours before being overwhelmed. This would delay the Germans significantly, but would likely result in the destruction or capture of his entire force. Alternatively, he could order staged withdrawals now, preserve his force for a defense further west, and yield Clervaux without a prolonged fight. This would save lives, but would open the road to Bastogne hours or even a day earlier, potentially changing the entire battle's outcome. Division orders removed the second option. Hold at all costs meant stay and fight. Fuller, looking at the map, calculated what all costs would purchase. If he could hold Clervaux even 12 hours, if he could force the Germans to deploy, assault, reduce the position properly instead of racing past, those hours might prove decisive elsewhere. Bastogne was 18 miles west. Reinforcements, he'd been told, were moving toward Bastogne. Every hour he held was an hour for those reinforcements to arrive. At 1,500 hours, Fuller issued orders that committed his regiment to its fate. All units would fall back to Clervaux and establish defensive positions in the town. The castle would serve as command post and final redoubt. Anti-tank guns would be positioned to cover the approach roads. Infantry would fortify buildings for urban defense. Tank destroyers, if any arrived, would be held in mobile reserve. Civilians would be ordered to shelter in place, preferably in cellars. Medical facilities would be established in the castle's lower chambers. This was defensive doctrine by the book, the kind of plan that looks competent on paper and feels like organized suicide when you're issuing the orders. Fuller briefed his company commanders, those still alive and in communication, with the flat professionalism that conceals emotion. They would hold Clervaux. They would make the Germans pay for it. They would buy time for the rest of the division, for the corps, for the Allied response that was surely organizing, even if they couldn't see it yet. Nobody asked about withdrawal plans because everyone understood there weren't any. The counterattack Fuller had ordered toward Marnock, Headquarters Company's 200 men and 5 Sherman tanks, ran into the vanguard of 2nd Panzer Division at 15:30 hours on the road between Clervaux and Marnock. The Americans were moving north, the Germans were moving south, and they met in a confusing engagement where neither side initially understood what they were fighting. The Shermans, 75mm guns against Panther 88s, were outgunned but had the advantage of surprise in the fog. The first American tank destroyed a German half-track. The second tank was hit by a Panther firing from hull-down position 200 yards away, the Sherman brewing up instantly, crew bailing out burning. The engagement devolved into chaos. American infantry and German panzer grenadiers fighting at ranges under 100 yards in fog so thick that soldiers from opposing sides walked past each other without realizing. After 30 minutes of confused fighting, the Americans withdrew, having lost 2 tanks and 37 men. The Germans paused to reorganize, having lost a tank and perhaps 50 men. The engagement accomplished nothing tactically. Strategically, it consumed another hour of German advance time. Fuller's assessment of the situation at 1600 hours was grimly realistic. The Germans would reach Clervaux's outskirts by evening. They would probably probe the defenses tonight and launch a serious assault tomorrow morning. His defenses consisted of hasty positions, inadequate anti-tank weapons, and exhausted men. He had no illusions about the outcome. The question was how long they could hold and at what cost to the Germans. He walked through Clervaux that afternoon, visiting positions, talking to soldiers, projecting the calm confidence that leadership requires, even when your heart is calculating casualty rates. Young soldiers, some still teenagers, looked to him for reassurance that they would survive. He gave them what they needed to hear. They were well positioned, they had good fields of fire, reinforcements were coming. He didn't mention that the reinforcements might arrive to find only rubble and corpses. The civilians of Clervaux were less easily reassured. Marie-Paul Marerus, organizing her cellar shelter, understood military reality better than soldiers half her age. She had lived through 4 years of German occupation. She knew what it meant when officers gave vague answers about how long they would hold. She gathered 30 neighbors in her cellar, mostly women and children and elderly, explained they would probably be there for days, maybe weeks. They needed food, water, sanitation, and most importantly discipline to avoid panic. Her cellar became a small fortress within the fortress, a space where normal rules applied even as the world above disintegrated. Children would attend lessons. Adults would maintain schedules. They would not become animals just because animals were fighting above them. This determination, repeated in cellars across Clervaux, created a parallel defense where civilians preserved humanity through the structure of ordinary life maintained in extraordinary circumstances. Fuller's final decision of the day was whether to evacuate the castle's historical treasures. Clervaux Castle housed a photography museum, Edward Steichen's Family of Man exhibition in early development, irreplaceable documents and artifacts from 8 centuries. The castle administrator begged Fuller to authorize evacuation, to save what could be saved before the fighting destroyed everything. Fuller refused. Moving anything required trucks and manpower he needed for ammunition and wounded. Moreover, evacuating artifacts would signal to both his troops and the civilians that he expected to lose. Morale required maintaining the fiction that they would hold, that Clervaux would remain American, that the castle would survive intact. The administrator accepted the decision with visible anguish. Within weeks, portions of the castle would burn and collapse. Some artifacts would be lost forever. Others would survive through chance and the fact that medieval stone doesn't burn easily. Fuller's choice would be debated by historians and preservationists for decades. In the moment, it was simply one more decision in a day of terrible choices. As darkness fell on December the 16th, Fuller stood again in the castle tower, looking east where fires marked Marnock burning 2 miles away. Tracers arced through the darkness, green German machine gun fire, and red American responding. The rumble of tanks was clearly audible, a mechanical growl that spoke of Panthers and Panzer IVs approaching on roads his men couldn't effectively block. He had done everything doctrine and experience told him to do. He had positioned his forces to maximum advantage. He had organized reserves and planned counterattacks and established communications. None of it would matter against the weight of metal approaching. What would matter was whether his soldiers chose to fight or flee when the assault came. That choice, made individually by hundreds of men in the next days, would determine everything. Fuller couldn't command courage. He could only create conditions where courage was possible. As he descended from the tower, he found himself thinking about the medieval knights who had defended this castle centuries ago. They had faced sieges, starvation, disease, overwhelming odds. Some had held and died. Others had held and survived. None, he suspected, had known which outcome awaited them until the end. He felt a strange kinship with those long-dead defenders. They had understood, as he now understood, that some positions must be held, not because victory is likely, but because the alternative is unacceptable. 1700 hours, December 16th. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein stood in the turret of his command half-track, watching the road ahead choked with stationary vehicles, and permitted himself the luxury of rage. His entire operational plan depended on speed, on maintaining momentum, on reaching objectives according to a timetable calculated down to the hour. Instead, his Panzer-Lehr division, supposedly the elite armored spearhead of the entire offensive, was stalled behind smoking villages, where American companies that should have evaporated like morning fog were still fighting. Marnock should have fallen by 0800. It was now 1700, and his reconnaissance battalion was reporting the village finally secured, but requiring engineer support to clear rubble from the main road. Hosingen, which wasn't even supposed to require assault, was still holding out with an American company that had somehow survived being surrounded for 10 hours. The road to Clervaux, clearly visible on his map as a straight line requiring perhaps 40 minutes transit, remained contested. Bayerlein, who had commanded troops in Africa and Normandy, who had learned from Rommel himself how to conduct armored operations, was being defeated by delays measured in hours accumulating into catastrophe. The fuel situation was transforming from concern to crisis. Each Panther tank carried approximately 200 gallons of gasoline, providing roughly 100 kilometers of range in ideal conditions. Combat operations, with maneuvering and idling and sudden accelerations, consumed fuel at rates 50% higher than planning estimates. Bayerlein's tanks had now traveled perhaps 20 kilometers from their start lines, but had been operational for over 12 hours. Many were already below half fuel capacity. The fuel trucks that were supposed to keep pace with the advance were themselves stalled behind infantry battles and road congestion. German planning had anticipated capturing American fuel dumps within the first 24 hours, specifically the massive depot at Bastogne. Those plans assumed reaching Bastogne by end of day 1. It was becoming clear that Bastogne wouldn't be reached until day 2 at earliest, possibly day 3. Every hour of delay meant another hour burning fuel without replacement. Bayerlein's staff calculated remaining range, factored in combat consumption, and delivered estimates that made retreat the only logical option. Bayerlein, reading these estimates, crumpled the paper and threw it from his vehicle. They would reach the Meuse or die trying. There was no third option. The frustration coursing through the German command structure found its outlet in tactical brutality. At Betborn, a crossroads hamlet between Marnock and Clervaux, a column from the 1st SS Panzer Corps encountered 8 American medics who had been treating wounded when the German advance overran their position. The medics, clearly marked with Red Cross armbands and accompanied by wounded soldiers on stretchers, attempted to surrender. The SS officer commanding the lead element, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Bernhardt, was a veteran of the Eastern Front where brutality had become routine and mercy was weakness. He ordered his men to machine gun the medics and wounded. 14 Americans died in 30 seconds. A Luxembourg farmer, Alphonse Wolff, watched from his barn window, 200 yards away, photographing the scene in his memory with the precision that comes from absolute horror. He would testify at war crimes trials in 1947, his testimony securing convictions. In the moment, he could only hide and shake and understand that the Germans were back, and the rules, such as they were, no longer applied. The massacre at Betborn was not isolated. In 19 different locations across the 110th Regiment's sector, on December 16th and 17th, German forces executed American prisoners or wounded soldiers. Some killings were the calculated terrorism of SS units that had learned their trade in the East. Others were the desperate acts of frustrated soldiers behind schedule and furious at resistance they hadn't expected. The Malmedy massacre, where 84 American prisoners were machine-gunned near the northern edge of the offensive, would become famous. The smaller executions in the Clervaux sector would fade into footnotes. The victims were equally dead. The effect on surviving American soldiers, word spreading through whispered conversations and official warnings, was galvanizing. Surrendering to SS troops meant probable execution. Fighting to the last round became not heroism, but rational survival strategy. German commanders, even those who disapproved of the killings, didn't prevent them because maintaining advance momentum mattered more than enforcing Geneva Convention niceties against an enemy they believed would never hold them accountable. By 1800 hours, the first German reconnaissance elements reached the hills overlooking Clervaux. The town spread below them in the river valley, medieval architecture climbing hillsides, the castle dominating the western heights. Smoke rose from scattered buildings hit by artillery during the day. American vehicles moved through streets with the organized confusion that suggested defensive preparations in progress. The reconnaissance officers, observing through binoculars in fading December light, made their assessments. The town was defended, probably by battalion strength or more, judging by activity. The approaches were narrow, suitable for ambush. The castle's elevation would provide excellent observation for artillery spotters. A night assault would be chaotic and costly. Better to wait for dawn, bring up heavy weapons, conduct proper reconnaissance. These were professional military judgments that prioritized force preservation over speed. The reports traveled up the chain of command, reaching Bayerlein and von Lauchor by 1900 hours. Both Panzer Division commanders faced the same decision: attack tonight, despite disadvantages, or wait for morning and fall further behind schedule. The debate at German headquarters that evening revealed the growing desperation infecting the offensive. Model, commanding Army Group B from his headquarters in Münster-Eifel, received reports of delays across the entire front. 5th Panzer Army, attacking in the center, was behind schedule. 6th S Panzer Army, the main effort in the north, was stalled before the Elsenborn Ridge. 7th Army in the south was making minimal progress. Nowhere had the offensive achieved the breakthrough momentum that the plan required. American resistance, expected to collapse under massed assault, was instead stiffening. Weather forecasts suggested the fog would lift within 48 hours, bringing Allied air power back into the equation. The time window for success was closing before German forces had even reached their intermediate objectives. Model's chief of staff suggested a 24-hour operational pause to consolidate gains and reassess. Model rejected the suggestion with language that would have been censored from official reports. There would be no pause. Divisions would attack on their assigned axes. Commanders would achieve objectives or be relieved. The offensive would continue until it succeeded, or until there was nothing left to continue with. Von Lauchar, 2nd Panzer Division commander, decided to probe Clervaux's defenses that night, despite his reconnaissance officer's recommendations. He couldn't afford to wait until morning. Every hour lost was another hour Allied reserves could reposition. He ordered his lead tank battalion to advance on Clervaux with infantry support, test American strength and positions, exploit any weakness discovered. If the town fell, excellent. If not, they would have reconnaissance information for a proper dawn assault. The attack began at 2100 hours. Panthers and Panzer Grenadiers moving down the main road in darkness, relieved only by occasional flares and burning buildings. The Germans expected perhaps a company holding Clervaux. They encountered Fuller's consolidated defense, approximately 500 men with anti-tank guns positioned at carefully selected kill zones. The first Panther rounded a curve and took an armor-piercing round through the turret at 60 yards range. The tank behind it tried to reverse and was hit by a bazooka team firing from a second-story window. The road, already narrow, became impassable. German infantry dismounted and began clearing buildings, encountering American riflemen who knew every cellar and alley. The probe became a battle. The battle became a stalemate, and after 3 hours the Germans withdrew, having lost 3 tanks and perhaps 80 men without gaining any useful ground. Bayerlein, receiving reports of the failed night assault, made his decision at midnight. Panzerlehr would not attack Clervaux frontally. The town was too defensible, the approach too restrictive. Instead, he would bypass it to the south, send his tanks cross-country through the Drafeld area, rejoin the main road west of Clervaux at Urspelt, and leave reduction of the American strongpoint to following infantry. This decision, tactically sound, violated the operational plan that required clearing all resistance along the axis of advance. It also meant accepting even more delay as tanks negotiated terrain not suited for armored movement. Von Lauchort, commanding 2nd Panzer, made a different decision. His division would continue pressuring Clervaux from the north, while sending a secondary force to envelop from the east. The town would fall through combined arms assault, properly conducted, accepting the time cost as necessary to maintain tactical integrity. These divergent decisions meant that instead of one concentrated assault on Clervaux, the Americans would face pressure from multiple directions on staggered timetables. Paradoxically, this would give Fuller additional hours to organize defense. The civilians of Clervaux, huddled in cellars, experienced that night as a descent into chaos they thought they'd escaped 9 months earlier. Artillery fire was nearly continuous, the shriek and crash of shells punctuated by the heavier crump of tank guns firing at street-level targets. Machine gun fire chattered in long bursts that suggested suppressive fire rather than aimed shots. Individual rifle shots cracked irregularly, each one representing a specific human target acquired and engaged. The Majoris cellar shook with each nearby detonation, dust filtering from ceiling joists, children crying despite their parents' attempts at comfort. Marie-Paul Majoris organized the space like a military operation, assigning tasks that kept hands busy and minds occupied. Inventory the food, ration the water, maintain the sanitation bucket, tell stories to the children, pray when prayers seem appropriate. Above all, maintain structure, maintain humanity, refuse to let fear transform them into huddled animals waiting for slaughter. Other cellars, lacking such organization, descended into panic and despair. The difference between survival and breakdown was often just one person who refused to surrender to circumstances. The German soldiers attacking that night were not monsters, though some committed monstrous acts. They were exhausted men operating on minimal sleep, sustained by methamphetamine tablets issued to maintain alertness, driving toward objectives they increasingly doubted they could reach. A Panzer Grenadier named Johann Kessler, 20 years old, from a farming family in Bavaria, wrote in his diary that night about clearing a Clervaux building room by room, finding an elderly couple dead in their bed from concussion effect of a shell that had hit 2 rooms away. He wrote about feeling nothing, which frightened him more than the combat itself. The numbness that had crept over him during 2 years on the Eastern Front was complete. He could kill without emotion. He could see death without reaction. He wondered, in careful pencil script in a pocket notebook, whether he would ever feel anything again, or whether war had hollowed him into a shell that looked human but contained nothing human. He would be killed 3 days later near Bastogne, the diary found by American soldiers and eventually donated to a military museum where it sits in archival storage, a document from the other side that humanizes without excusing. By 0300 hours, December 17th, both German divisions had pulled back from immediate contact with Clervaux's defenses. The night attacks had accomplished little beyond confirming that the town was strongly held and would require sustained assault to reduce. German commanders, calculating fuel consumption and casualties against time gained, faced unpalatable mathematics. They were now approximately 18 hours behind the operational timetable. Clervaux, which should have fallen by noon December 16th, remained American. Bastogne, which should have been reached by evening December 16th, was still 18 miles away across contested terrain. The Meuse River, the crucial operational objective, was further than ever despite a day of advances measured in miles. The offensive was failing its initial test, the test of maintaining momentum against a surprised enemy. What would happen when surprise faded and Allied reserves began concentrating was a question no German commander wanted to consider deeply. They had committed to this offensive with everything remaining. Success was the only option because failure meant the end. So, they would continue attacking, continue burning fuel they couldn't replace, continue feeding men into battles that were supposed to be over already. The alternative, admitting defeat and ordering retreat, was unthinkable. German military culture, particularly under Hitler's increasingly delusional command, had lost the ability to recognize when objectives were unattainable. So, the attacks would continue, and Clervaux would burn, and time would be purchased in blood until there was nothing left to buy. Night of December 16th to 17th, 1944. In the darkness between midnight and dawn, Clervaux transformed from a tourist town hosting American soldiers into an improvised fortress where every building became a bunker, and every civilian a participant in survival. Captain Clark Mackey, who had brought the remnants of Company K into Clervaux after fighting their way out of Hausingen's encirclement, found himself assigned to organize the southern defensive sector with men he'd never met, commanding positions he'd scouted for perhaps 20 minutes. This was battle doctrine inverted, the careful planning and rehearsal that normally preceded defensive operations, compressed into frantic hours where decisions were made based on instinct rather than reconnaissance. Mackey positioned his depleted company, now numbering maybe 40 effectives, in stone buildings that offered good fields of fire toward the approaches Panzer Lehr would use if they bypassed from the south. He had no mines, no wire, insufficient anti-tank weapons, and absolutely no illusions about stopping a panzer division. His job was to make them pay for passage and to buy time measured in hours rather than glory. The 5 Sherman tanks that constituted Fuller's entire armored reserve were positioned at key intersections throughout Clervaux, their commanders understanding with professional clarity that they were mobile pillboxes awaiting execution. Staff Sergeant Grant Yeager, commanding the Sherman positioned at the intersection of Route 18 and the road to the castle, had fought in Normandy and survived 3 tanks being destroyed under him. He knew the sound of a Panther's 88mm gun, that distinctive crack that preceded death by perhaps a half second. He knew that his Sherman 75mm gun was inadequate against Panther frontal armor, that his only chances of survival involved ambush at close range targeting side or rear shots. He also knew that his tank's position, parked at a street intersection with limited maneuver room, made ambush tactics nearly impossible. He would get 1 shot, maybe 2, before being destroyed. His crew, 4 men he'd trained with for 8 months, understood this without discussion. They loaded armor-piercing rounds, positioned smoke grenades for emergency concealment, and made their peace with whatever gods they acknowledged. The castle itself became the ultimate defensive position through accident of medieval architecture rather than modern engineering. The fortress had been built in successive phases from the 11th through 16th centuries, its designers considering threats from siege engines and scaling ladders rather than tank guns and artillery. The result was a structure with walls between 2 and 4 feet thick, constructed of local stone that had weathered 8 centuries of weather and would prove surprisingly resistant to 20th century explosives. The castle's commanding position on a hill overlooking Clervaux provided observation across the entire town and approaches. Fuller established his command post in the central keep, radio operators and runners replacing medieval knights, situation maps replacing tapestries. The castle's disadvantages were equally significant. It had a single access road, making resupply difficult. The medieval chambers and passages, designed for pre-gunpowder warfare, created deadly ricochets when shells or bullets entered through windows. The structure was fundamentally a pre-modern fortress being pressed into modern service, effective in ways its builders never imagined, and vulnerable in ways no 20th century engineer would accept. Quartermaster troops, men whose normal duties involved issuing boots and managing supply forms, found themselves issued rifles and assigned defensive positions. Private Leonard Katz, a clerk from Brooklyn who had last fired a rifle in basic training 14 months earlier, spent December 16th learning to operate a Browning automatic rifle from a combat engineer who had been pressed into teaching because he had actual experience using the weapon. Katz's position was a second-floor room in a stone building covering the northern approach. His field of fire, a narrow street where German infantry would have to advance if they wanted to clear the sector. He had 5 20-round magazines, approximately 20 seconds of sustained fire if he kept his finger on the trigger. The engineer had been very clear about fire discipline, about aiming shots rather than spraying ammunition, about the fact that an empty bar was just an awkward club. Katz, who had joined the army expecting to spend the war processing paperwork in supply depots, was now a rifleman defending a medieval town against panzer divisions. The absurdity was so complete it became banal. He loaded his magazines, checked his sights, and waited for morning. The combat engineers who had been in Clervaux repairing bridges found their mission parameters radically altered. Lieutenant Paul Morrison, commanding the engineer platoon, received orders from Fuller personally: prepare the castle and key buildings for prolonged defense, establish demolitions on bridges to deny their use if Clervaux fell, create obstacles to channel German armor into kill zones. Morrison had 50 men, assorted explosives, sandbags, and perhaps 12 hours before serious assault began. He prioritized ruthlessly. The castle received firing positions cut through walls, providing interlocking fields of fire while maintaining structural integrity. The main bridge over the Clervaux River received demolition charges wired to a command detonator, insurance if Fuller ordered withdrawal. Key buildings got sandbag reinforcement at street level, protection against small arms and shell fragments if not against direct tank gun hits. The work proceeded through the night, engineers moving with the smooth efficiency of men trained to work under fire, accepting risk as occupational hazard. Morrison, supervising the work, estimated they accomplished perhaps 60% of what proper defensive preparation required. It would have to suffice. Civilians were simultaneously shelter seekers and participants in defense. Marie-Paul Majerus emerged from her cellar at dawn, December 17th, to find American soldiers fortifying the building next to hers, knocking loopholes through stone walls, positioning sandbags. A young lieutenant, exhausted and filthy, asked if she could guide soldiers through the town's passages and courtyards, many of which connected in ways not obvious from streets. She agreed, becoming an unofficial scout, showing Americans how buildings connected through shared cellars, where walls were thin enough to breach for movement, which routes offered cover from observation. Other civilians provided similar assistance, motivated by self-interest as much as solidarity. If the Americans held longer, perhaps the Germans could be stopped. If the Germans were stopped, perhaps Luxembourg would remain free. If Luxembourg remained free, perhaps families would survive the war intact. These calculations, never spoken aloud but understood universally, transformed civilians into allies of necessity. The deployment of anti-tank weapons across Clervaux represented Fuller's most critical tactical decision. He had perhaps 8 operational 57mm anti-tank guns, a dozen bazookas, and improvised Molotov cocktails assembled from bottles and gasoline. Against an armored division, this was asymmetric warfare, where American defenders needed perfect positioning and execution to survive, even briefly. Fuller positioned the 57mm guns to cover the 3 main approach roads, each gun with overlapping fields of fire, so German tanks couldn't suppress one position without exposing themselves to others. Bazooka teams received orders to operate from upper floors and rooftops, firing at side and rear armor before immediately displacing. The Molotov cocktails were weapons of desperation, effective only at ranges so close that throwers rarely survived employment. Fuller, briefing his anti-tank teams, was blunt about life expectancy. They would likely get 1 shot, maybe 2. Make them count. Conserve ammunition. Aim for vulnerable points. Except that they were trading their lives for time. As dawn broke on December 17th, Clervaux existed in the strange liminal state between normalcy and apocalypse. Smoke rose from smoldering buildings damaged in night fighting. American soldiers occupied fighting positions, smoking cigarettes and eating cold rations, exhibiting the grim humor that characterizes infantry awaiting attack. German forces, visible on surrounding hills, were preparing assaults with professional thoroughness, positioning artillery, moving infantry into attack positions, conducting final reconnaissance. Civilians in cellars prayed or slept, or simply waited, understanding that their survival depended entirely on events they couldn't control or even see. Fuller, in the castle command post, calculated odds and prepared for what was coming. He had perhaps 800 men in defensive positions, adequate ammunition for one day of intense fighting, no realistic chance of reinforcement. Against him came division-strength forces with overwhelming superiority in armor and artillery. The only advantages American defenders possessed were knowledge of terrain, defensive positions, and the determination that comes from having nowhere to retreat. Those advantages would have to suffice. The psychology of defenders awaiting assault is a subject military psychiatrists have studied extensively, but never fully explained. Men who days earlier had been joking about weekend passes and complaining about cold rations now faced probable death with varying degrees of acceptance. Some wrote final letters home, carefully worded notes that said everything important without explicitly acknowledging they expected to die. Others slept, the exhaustion of combat operations allowing unconsciousness despite circumstances. A few prayed, regardless of prior religious conviction, finding in crisis a need for communion with something larger than themselves. Most simply waited, checking weapons repeatedly, smoking cigarettes, making dark jokes about the situation. The human mind's capacity to normalize imminent death through routine and humor is remarkable, and perhaps the only reason men can function in such circumstances. Sergeant Yeager, sitting in his Sherman's turret, as dawnlight grew, found himself thinking about his wife's reaction when she received the telegram. He hoped she would remarry. She was young enough, pretty enough, deserved better than widowhood. Then he stopped thinking about it because that path led to paralysis. He focused instead on the immediate tactical problem. Where would the first German tank appear, and could he kill it before it killed him? The Germans, visible through the growing light, were conducting final preparations with methodical precision. Artillery spotters marked targets on maps. Tank commanders conducted final checks of guns and radios. Infantry squads reviewed assault assignments, identifying which buildings they would clear in which sequence. The professionalism was impressive and terrible to watch, the machinery of destruction preparing to operate with the efficiency that had made the Wehrmacht legendary. American observers, watching through binoculars from concealed positions, saw this preparation and understood what it meant. The probing attacks and night skirmishes were over. The real battle, the sustained assault aimed at crushing Clervaux's defense, would begin within hours. Fuller, receiving these reports, issued final orders to company commanders. Hold your positions. Engage at maximum effective range. Fall back only when your position becomes untenable. Casualties who can move should report to the castle aid station. Those who can't should be left where they fall. There was no time for rescue or evacuation. This was combat reduced to its essentials. Kill the enemy, survive if possible, accept death if necessary. At 0700 hours, December 17th, German artillery began ranging shots. The first shells impacted harmlessly in fields north of town. The second volley hit buildings in the northern sector. The third volley walked through American positions with devastating accuracy. The Battle of Clervaux, which had been a series of skirmishes and delays, was becoming a siege. 0900 hours, December 17th. The German assault on Clervaux began with a barrage that made the previous day's artillery seem restrained by comparison. Over 100 guns, everything from light field howitzers to heavy 150mm pieces, dropped shells onto the town with systematic precision that spoke to excellent forward observation and fire coordination. The barrage wasn't random destruction, but surgical targeting. Each salvo aimed at known or suspected American positions identified through night reconnaissance. Buildings that had been fortified by American engineers received special attention, shells hammering stone facades until walls collapsed inward. The castle, visible on its hill, and obviously the command center, was engaged by multiple batteries simultaneously. Medieval walls that had withstood centuries proved surprisingly resistant, the solid stone construction absorbing impacts that would have demolished modern structures. But resistance wasn't immunity. Windows shattered, interior walls crumbled, stone fragments became deadly projectiles ricocheting through chambers where radio operators and staff officers worked. 2nd Panzer Division's main assault came from the north, approximately 30 tanks supported by mechanized infantry, attacking down the primary road toward Clervaux's center. Colonel von Laukert had learned from the previous night's repulse. This time, there would be no headlong advance into prepared positions. Instead, tanks would move under covering artillery, suppress American positions with main gunfire, allow infantry to clear buildings methodically. The lead Panther entered Clervaux's northern edge at 09:15, its commander traversing the turret to engage targets of opportunity. The tank made it perhaps 30 yards before Staff Sergeant Jaeger's Sherman, positioned in a narrow side street, fired from 80 yards range into the Panther's side armor. The armor-piercing round penetrated, detonating ammunition stored along the Panther's hull. The explosion was spectacular and terrifying, the turret separating from the chassis and flipping backwards, 40 tons of steel becoming a projectile that crashed through a building facade. The surviving crew bailed out burning, rolling in snow to extinguish flames, their screams audible over the battle's roar. Jaeger's Sherman crew had perhaps 15 seconds to celebrate before they realized their single successful engagement had revealed their position to every German within visual range. 3 Panthers and 2 Panzer Mark IVs oriented on the intersection where Jaeger's tank sat. The first German round missed high, smashing through the upper story of the building behind the Sherman. The second round hit the Sherman's glacis plate and glanced off, the deflection causing only shock and terror rather than penetration and death. Jaeger's driver, without orders, reversed at maximum speed into the narrow alley behind their position, the Sherman's transmission screaming in protest. A German round followed them into the alley, impacting exactly where the Sherman had been 2 seconds earlier. Jaeger, adrenaline-overwhelming training, screamed into his radio for any American position to engage the German tanks, now isolated at the intersection. A bazooka team, positioned 3 buildings away, rose from cover and fired at the closest Panther. The rocket hit the turret at an angle and deflected skyward without penetrating. The bazooka team's second man, already loading another rocket, took a machine gun burst through the chest and died loading. The first man grabbed the bazooka and ran, making it perhaps 20 feet before German rifle fire cut him down. The battle devolved into 100 separate firefights occurring simultaneously across a half-mile of urban terrain. German infantry, dismounted from their half-tracks, moved building to building using doctrine developed in Stalingrad and perfected through years of brutal combat. Clear rooms with grenades first, then follow with automatic weapons fire, then verify with rifle shots to wounded who might be feigning. American defenders, less experienced in urban warfare, learned through survival or died learning. Private Katz, the supply clerk turned rifleman, fired his bar in controlled bursts at German soldiers visible in street below his second-floor position. He hit 2, maybe 3 before a panzer commander identified his position and traversed the main gun upward. The 75mm high-explosive round hit the building just below Katz's window, the concussion throwing him across the room, shattering both his eardrums. Deaf and disoriented, he crawled to a different window and resumed firing because stopping meant dying, and at least shooting back felt like control. Captain Mackey, commanding the southern sector, watched German forces approaching from his command post in a building basement. Panzerlehr Division's bypass had put tanks on the road west of Clervaux, exactly as feared. Now those tanks were turning back east, catching American defenders between 2 German forces. Mackey had 40 men and 2 anti-tank guns against approximately 20 tanks and 500 infantry. The mathematics were unambiguous. He could hold perhaps an hour, maybe 2 with luck, before being overwhelmed or encircled. He radioed Fuller at the castle, reporting the situation in clipped, military prose that concealed nothing. Fuller's response was equally professional: hold as long as possible, withdraw to the castle when position becomes untenable, destroy anything of value before retreating. Mackey acknowledged, then turned to his platoon leaders and gave orders. They would fight from current positions until ammunition ran low or casualties made defense impossible. Then they would fall back in teams, covering each other, to the castle. Nobody asked about those who couldn't walk. Everyone understood. The civilians trapped in cellars experienced the street fighting as a nightmare of sound and vibration, transmitted through stone and earth. In Marie-Paul Majerus's cellar, 30 people huddled in darkness, relieved only by a single candle, listening to explosions that shook dust from ceiling joists and made children cry despite exhaustion. The building above them was being fought over, American voices shouting orders mixing with German commands, rifle fire and grenade explosions transmitted through walls and floors. At one point, boots clattered on the floor directly above the cellar, too heavy to be anything but soldiers, too numerous to be a single person passing through. The cellar occupants held their collective breath, children's mouths covered by parents' hands, everyone frozen in animal terror. The soldiers moved on without investigating the cellar entrance. Majoris would later learn they were American troops withdrawing from street-level positions to a building across the alley. In the moment, they were just threatening sounds representing potential death. German commanders, observing the battle's progress from hills overlooking Clervaux, were calculating time against casualties and finding the mathematics increasingly problematic. The town should have fallen by noon. It was approaching 1400 hours, and American resistance, while clearly degrading, remained organized and effective. German casualties were mounting, perhaps 200 killed and wounded, 8 tanks destroyed or disabled. These were acceptable losses in context of the objective, but unacceptable in context of the schedule. Every hour spent reducing Clervaux was an hour not spent advancing toward Bastogne and the Meuse. Von Lauchert, 2nd Panzer Commander, debated with his staff whether to commit more force to Clervaux or bypass entirely and leave reduction to follow-on infantry. The debate consumed 30 minutes and concluded with compromise. Continue the assault with current forces, but set a deadline of 1600 hours, after which lead elements would bypass and continue west regardless of Clervaux's status. This decision, made in a command vehicle on a hillside overlooking burning buildings, determined that Clervaux would not be the quick breakthrough Germans needed, but would not become the all-consuming battle that stopped their advance entirely. It represented professional military judgment that prioritized operational objectives over tactical completeness. It also guaranteed that Fuller's defense would last longer than the half-day he might have hoped for, but shorter than the multiple days he'd been ordered to achieve. The result would be approximately 36 hours of sustained combat, enough to fatally disrupt German timetables, but insufficient to stop the offensive entirely. This calculus, invisible to the soldiers fighting in Clervaux's streets, would prove more significant than any individual act of heroism or tactical decision made in the town itself. By 1600 hours, German forces had penetrated to Clervaux's center, though at costs that made victory feel Pyrrhic. American defenders had withdrawn from the northern and southern sectors, consolidating in the town center and castle area. The withdrawal was fighting retreat, not rout. American soldiers firing from one position, then displacing to the next under covering fire from squad mates. Casualties among defenders were approaching 50%, dead and wounded roughly equal, the wounded being carried to the castle's improvised aid station, where doctors and medics worked in medieval chambers by flashlight and candlelight. The German advance, measured in yards per hour rather than miles, was professional but exhausted. Infantry had been fighting continuously for 7 hours. Tank crews had been operational for 33 hours, sustained by methamphetamine and adrenaline. The momentum that armored warfare required was absent, replaced by grinding attrition warfare, where victory was measured in buildings captured rather than objectives achieved. Staff Sergeant Jaeger's Sherman, having survived the morning engagement, was repositioned at the base of the castle hill, dug into a hull-down position that protected everything except the turret. Jaeger, professional to his core despite exhaustion, understood this was likely his last position. The castle provided nowhere to retreat to. When Germans reached here, the fighting would be point blank. His crew, 3 men still effective after their loader had been wounded by shell fragments, loaded their last armor-piercing rounds and waited. They could see German tanks maneuvering in the lower town, roughly 300 yards away, turrets traversing to engage American positions. Jaeger identified a Panther advancing down the main street, calculated angles and distances, and waited for optimal range. At 250 yards, he gave the fire command. The 75mm gun barked, recoil rocking the Sherman in its hull-down position. The round hit the Panther's turret ring, a lucky shot that jammed the turret and killed the gunner. The Panther stopped, immobilized by damage if not destroyed. Jaeger's crew cheered, then fell silent as 3 German tanks oriented on their position. The first German round hit the rubble in front of their hull-down position, sending stone fragments pinging off armor. The second round hit the Sherman's turret directly, penetrating and detonating inside the fighting compartment. Jaeger, operating the turret machine gun in the cupola, was killed instantly. His 3 surviving crew members bailed out through the floor escape hatch, all wounded, all alive, stumbling uphill toward the castle as German machine gun fire chased them. Night fell on a battle that had consumed a day without producing decision. German forces held most of Clervaux, but had failed to crack the American defense concentrated in the castle and immediate surroundings. American forces had lost perhaps 350 of their original 800 defenders, but maintained organized resistance. The stalemate was temporary, both sides understood, but its existence at all represented German failure against the timetable that was supposed to guide this offensive to victory. Fuller, in the castle, calculated his options and found them limited. He could hold perhaps another 12 to 24 hours, depending on German commitment level and ammunition consumption rates. Then his force would be destroyed or captured. The only question was whether those hours would matter, whether somewhere west of here the delays his regiment had bought were being translated into Allied countermeasures that could stop this offensive. He had no way to know. Division communications were intermittent, often interrupted by German jamming or cut cables. Higher headquarters was preoccupied with crises elsewhere. Fuller and his soldiers were effectively isolated, fighting a private battle whose significance they could only hope existed. They would hold the castle because they had orders to hold. Whether those orders made sense, whether the sacrifice would be worth it, whether anyone would remember or care, remained to be answered by a future none of them might live to see. December 18th, 0200 hours. Colonel Fuller sat in the castle's medieval Great Hall, now a command post lit by failing generators and candles that cast shadows dancing on 8-century-old stone. His staff, reduced to 3 officers and a handful of runners, updated situation maps that told a story of progressive annihilation. The perimeter had contracted to perhaps 200 yards around the castle, a circle of resistance that was shrinking with each German probe. American casualties now exceeded 60% of the force that had begun defending Clervaux 36 hours earlier. Ammunition was critically low, medical supplies exhausted, food reduced to whatever soldiers carried in their packs. Fuller's last radio contact with 28th Division headquarters had come at midnight, a scratchy transmission ordering him to continue holding while Corps organized relief forces. The transmission had ended mid-sentence, cut by German jamming or equipment failure. Fuller assumed no relief was coming. His orders remained clear: hold at all costs. The cost was being calculated in the lives of men who trusted him to spend their deaths wisely. The castle's medieval architecture, which had proven surprisingly resilient against artillery, was finally yielding to sustained bombardment. German forces, having secured the town, brought up heavy guns specifically to reduce the fortress. 150mm howitzers fired at near point-blank range, less than a mile away, dropping shells with precision that spoke to excellent forward observation. The thick stone walls absorbed punishment that would have demolished modern structures, but absorption wasn't immunity. Cracks appeared in walls. Sections of ceiling collapsed. The northwest tower, hit repeatedly by armor-piercing rounds designed for tank warfare, developed a structural crack that threatened collapse. Engineers shored it with timber, buying time measured in hours. The castle's greatest defensive advantage, its commanding elevation and thick walls, was becoming its death trap. There was one road down, easily covered by German fire. Escape meant abandoning wounded and running a gauntlet that few would survive. So the defenders stayed, fought from arrow slits and medieval passages, and waited for the assault they knew was coming. At 0600 hours, German forces launched what would be their final assault on the castle. They came from 3 directions simultaneously: infantry supported by flamethrower teams and satchel charges, determined to end this pocket of resistance that had consumed 2 days and casualties the offensive couldn't afford. American defenders, numbering perhaps 120 effectives from the 500 who had consolidated here, met them with everything remaining. Machine guns traversed firing on fixed lines, cutting down the first assault wave. Riflemen fired aim shots at leaders and weapon crews. The castle's single remaining mortar dropped rounds on German assembly areas, firing until its last round was expended. The fighting was intimate and terrible. Germans reaching the castle's outer walls, American defenders throwing grenades down on them, both sides taking casualties at rates that would have broken less determined units. The assault stalled after 30 minutes, German forces withdrawing to regroup. leaving dead piled at the castle approaches. Fuller, observing the repulse, understood it was temporary victory, purchasing only hours. His ammunition situation was beyond critical. Some positions had expended every round, soldiers holding rifles with empty chambers, waiting for Germans to close so they could use weapons as clubs. The aid station in the castle's lower chambers held over 100 wounded, many needing immediate evacuation to survive, none getting it because there was nowhere to evacuate to. Morphine was exhausted, surgeons performing amputations with soldiers biting leather to keep from screaming. Fuller, confronting the reality he'd avoided acknowledging, understood his options had narrowed to one: surrender before his entire force was annihilated. He called his surviving officers together in the Great Hall, 3 captains and 2 lieutenants, all wounded, all exhausted beyond the point where personality or training mattered. He told them he intended to surrender the castle to prevent further senseless casualties. Did anyone object? Nobody spoke. The silence was answer enough. The mechanics of surrender involved protocols established by Geneva Convention and violated frequently enough that Fuller had no illusions about safety. He sent a runner, Private Thomas Walsh, carrying a white flag improvised from a medical bandage, walking down the castle road toward German lines with his hands raised. Walsh was 19, terrified, absolutely certain he would be shot despite the flag. German soldiers held fire, their discipline asserting itself, allowing Walsh to approach and deliver Fuller's message. The American commander requested terms for honorable surrender. The German officer, a major whose name Walsh never learned, accepted the message and sent Walsh back with instructions. American forces would exit the castle in groups, leave all weapons, proceed to assembly area under guard. Officers would retain sidearms as recognition of honorable defense. Wounded would receive medical treatment. Fuller, receiving these terms via Walsh, accepted them. At 0800 hours, December 18th, the defense of Clervaux Castle ended. The scene that unfolded over the next 2 hours was surreal in its civility, overlaying absolute brutality. American soldiers emerged from the castle in small groups, hands raised, most wounded or supporting wounded comrades. German soldiers searched them for weapons, but allowed medics to continue treating casualties. Officers on both sides exchanged salutes, an acknowledgement of professional respect that seemed absurd given the previous day's violence. Fuller surrendered his sidearm to a German colonel who introduced himself with correct formality and complimented the defense as most stubborn and honorable. Fuller, too exhausted for false modesty or false humility, simply nodded. The German colonel then informed him he was prisoner of war, would be transported to interrogation center and then permanent camp, could expect treatment according to Geneva Convention. Fuller, looking at the burning town below the castle, at the rubble that had been Clervaux, wondered what conventions meant in wars fought without conventional restraint. Marie-Paule Magers emerged from her cellar at 0900 hours, 30 civilians blinking in daylight they hadn't seen for 40 hours, stepping into a town they barely recognized. Clervaux had been transformed into a moonscape of rubble and burning buildings. German soldiers occupied every street, tanks parked at intersections, infantry clearing remaining resistance pockets. American prisoners were being assembled in the town square, roughly 200 men sitting with hands on heads while German guards watched with professional alertness. Magers, seeing the prisoners, felt overwhelming relief that the battle had ended mixed with dread at what German occupation would mean. A German officer approached her, spoke in accented French, asked if she was in charge of the civilians. She acknowledged she'd organized her cellar group. He informed her civilians would remain in their homes, occupation authority would establish curfews and regulations, cooperation would be rewarded, and resistance punished. She understood the implicit threat. Luxembourg had survived 4 years of German occupation before. They would survive again. She nodded acknowledgement and returned to her cellar to inform the others. The German forces securing Clervaux were simultaneously victorious and defeated. They had taken the town, captured or killed its defenders, cleared a route for the advance to continue, but they had consumed 2 days doing it, 2 days in which the offensive's timetable had disintegrated beyond recovery. Von Lauchert, 2nd Panzer Division commander, received congratulations from higher headquarters for reducing a stubborn strongpoint. He accepted them without pleasure, understanding that congratulations for tactical victory couldn't disguise operational failure. His division was now 48 hours behind schedule. Fuel stocks were critically low, sustained only by captured American dumps that provided gasoline of wrong octane requiring field modification. Casualties exceeded 10%, dead and wounded both, with no replacements available. Most critically, the element of surprise that should have enabled rapid advance was completely exhausted. American forces across the entire front now understood this was major offensive, were repositioning reserves, establishing defensive lines. The window of opportunity, narrow to begin with, had closed before German forces reached their initial objectives. Fuller's journey into captivity began immediately. German military police loaded American officers into trucks for transport to interrogation centers in Germany. Fuller, looking back at Clervaux Castle as the truck departed, felt emotions he couldn't articulate. Pride that his men had fought well, guilt that he'd survived while many died, relief that the impossible burden of command had been lifted, fear about what captivity would entail. Most powerfully, a desperate need to know whether their stand had mattered, whether the hours and casualties they had traded had purchased anything beyond their own destruction. He had no way to know that 18 miles west, at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division had arrived with just hours to spare before German encirclement. He couldn't know that the delay at Clervaux had been one of multiple delays across the entire offensive front, delays that accumulated into timeline collapse. He couldn't know that historians would later identify Clervaux as a critical delay point, one of several actions that saved the Allied position in the Ardennes. He only knew he'd followed orders, held as long as humanly possible, and spent his regiment in the process. Whether that expenditure was worthwhile would be determined by events he could no longer influence. The castle itself, damaged but structurally intact, would become a monument to what had occurred there. German forces, establishing headquarters in the medieval fortress, found evidence of the defense that had frustrated them, spent shell casings by the thousands, bloodstains on stone floors, hastily dug graves in the courtyard, equipment destroyed rather than allowed to fall intact. The Germans, soldiers themselves, recognized what they found as evidence of professional defense conducted by competent soldiers, pushed beyond breaking point, yet refusing to break. A German officer, walking through the Great Hall, found Fuller's desk with papers still scattered across it. Among them was a letter Fuller had been writing to his wife, never completed, ending mid-sentence with, "If anything happens to me, know that I..." The officer carefully folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and ensured it was forwarded through proper channels. It would reach Fuller's wife in Pennsylvania 6 months later, one of countless small kindnesses that occurred even in war's worst moments, proof that humanity survived even when humans committed inhumanity. By noon on December 18th, Clervaux was fully occupied German territory. The battle that had raged for 2 days ended not with climax but anticlimax, surrender and occupation rather than final dramatic assault. The defenders, those who survived, were processed as prisoners and disappeared into the vast machinery of German POW camps. The civilians, those who survived, began the grim work of emerging from cellars, assessing damage, determining who was dead and who lived. The town itself, roughly 70% destroyed, stood as physical evidence of what occurs when modern warfare impacts medieval urbanism. And the castle, damaged but dominant on its hilltop, remained standing as it had stood through 8 centuries of previous wars. What made this battle different wasn't the castle's survival, but what its defenders had accomplished. They had held for 2 days against overwhelming force. They had delayed a major offensive at its most critical phase. They had demonstrated that even green troops with inadequate equipment could impose costs that changed operational calculations. None of this was apparent to the soldiers being loaded onto trucks for transport to POW camps. It would only become clear through analysis conducted long after the war ended. In the moment, Clervaux's fall seemed like defeat, total and unambiguous. History would judge differently. December 18th, 1944, 1500 hours. In a concrete bunker 30 miles east of Clervaux, staff officers of German Army Group B compiled reports from across the Ardennes offensive and confronted mathematics that demolished optimism. The master timetable, prepared with meticulous detail before the offensive, showed where German forces should be at 48 hours. Lead elements approaching the Meuse River, Bastogne secured or bypassed. American forces in disarray and retreat. Reality was catastrophically different. No German unit had reached the Meuse. Bastogne was surrounded but not taken, tying down forces needed for exploitation. American resistance, expected to collapse under surprise assault, had instead stiffened into organized defense. Every axis of advance reported delays, casualties, fuel shortages. The offensive, designed to reach Antwerp in 7 days, had consumed 2 days and barely covered 1/3 the required distance. Staff officers, trained to present information without editorial comment, nevertheless conveyed through tone and body language their assessment. The operation was failing. Generaloberst Model, commanding Army Group B, reviewed these reports with the stoicism of a professional soldier who has seen too many operations fail through accumulated friction. He focused on specific delay points, identifying where American resistance had most effectively disrupted the schedule. The Elsenborn Ridge in the north had held against 6th SS Panzer Army, frustrating the main effort. St. Vith, a critical road junction, remained American after 2 days of assault. And here, in his sector, Clervaux and the surrounding defensive positions had consumed precious hours at the offensive's most time-sensitive phase. Model, studying maps showing German positions overlaid with the original timeline, understood that recovery was mathematically impossible. To reach the Meuse by the planned date required average advance rates of 20 miles per day for the next 3 days. His forces, having averaged 10 miles per day against surprised opposition, couldn't possibly maintain 20 against alerted defenders with weather improving and Allied air power returning. The offensive hadn't been stopped. It had been delayed into irrelevance. The fuel situation, problematic from the start, had become catastrophic. German planners had calculated minimum fuel requirements assuming capture of American dumps on schedule. Those dumps, especially the massive facility at Bastogne, were either destroyed by retreating Americans or remained behind unconquered American lines. German fuel trucks, bringing supplies forward from Germany, consumed their own cargo, simply transporting it through the narrow road network, now clogged with military traffic. 2nd Panzer Division, the spearhead that had fought through Clervaux, reported operational tanks at 30% fuel capacity. Panzer Lehr Division reported similar numbers. Both divisions had essentially one good attack remaining before running dry. Without captured fuel, the offensive would literally stop moving, regardless of tactical situation. German logistics officers calculated consumption rates against remaining stocks and delivered verdicts, measured in hours rather than days. The mathematical certainty of this calculation was irrefutable and devastating. Speed had been essential because logistics couldn't sustain prolonged operations. The delays imposed at Clervaux and elsewhere had extended operations beyond sustainable duration. Allied intelligence, piecing together fragmented reports from across the Ardennes, was beginning to understand the offensive's true scale and its limitations. Ultra-intercepts of German radio traffic revealed frustration at delays, demands for faster advance, threats to relieve commanders who failed to meet objectives. Allied analysts, reading these intercepts, understood that German timetable problems were severe. If the Germans themselves were concerned about delays, those delays must be strategic rather than merely tactical. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force began repositioning reserves toward the Ardennes, pulling divisions from quiet sectors and even from England to reinforce the threatened area. The most critical reinforcement was the 101st Airborne Division's movement to Bastogne, arriving on December 18th, just hours before German encirclement closed. That arrival, which created the conditions for Bastogne's famous defense, was directly enabled by delays imposed at places like Clervaux. Every hour the 110th Infantry Regiment bought was an hour for the 101st to move toward Bastogne. The causal chain was invisible to participants, but clear to historians, analyzing timelines afterward. The 101st Airborne Division's arrival at Bastogne represented the moment when American defense transitioned from crisis management to organized resistance. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, assuming command of Bastogne's defense, found a garrison already established, including elements of the 10th Armored Division, combat engineers, artillery batteries, and surviving units from various formations that had retreated into the town. This wasn't the empty road junction Germans expected to capture unopposed. It was a hastily organized but competent defensive force, occupying the most strategically significant terrain in the entire offensive sector. McAuliffe, professional and unflappable, established defensive perimeter, positioned artillery, coordinated with adjacent units, and prepared for siege. When German forces surrounded Bastogne on December 20th and demanded surrender, McAuliffe's one-word response, "Nuts," became legendary. What made that defiance possible was the time purchased at Clervaux and other delay points. Without those delays, Germans would have reached Bastogne before significant reinforcement arrived, confronting perhaps a battalion instead of a division. German commanders, interviewing American prisoners including Fuller, sought to understand how such stubborn resistance had been organized, with units described in intelligence reports as exhausted and demoralized. Fuller required, by Geneva Convention, to provide only name, rank, and serial number, nevertheless engaged in professional discussions about defensive tactics. His German interrogators, themselves experienced officers, were genuinely curious how American commanders with inadequate forces and minimal preparation had delayed veteran panzer divisions. Fuller's answer was honest. They followed doctrine, used terrain advantages, and refused to panic when surrounded. Most importantly, they had orders to hold and interpreted those orders as binding regardless of consequences. The German officers recording this conversation understood they were hearing explanation for their offensive's failure. American soldiers, even green troops, fought with discipline and determination when properly led. Breaking that kind of resistance required time the offensive didn't have. The strategic impact of Clervaux's delay became visible through its effect on subsequent operations. 2nd Panzer Division, having finally cleared the Clervaux bottleneck on December 18th, raced west toward the Meuse River, with the desperation of men understanding their time was expiring. They bypassed Bastogne to the north, leaving it for following infantry, and achieved the deepest penetration of the entire offensive. By December 24th, 2nd Panzer's lead reconnaissance battalion reached Selles, just 4 miles from the Meuse River and the farthest west any German unit would advance. There they stopped, not from American resistance, but from fuel exhaustion. Tanks ran dry and died in place, crews abandoning vehicles as American forces counterattacked. The division that had fought through Clervaux ultimately came within sight of its objective, only to fail from logistical starvation. The irony was bitter and complete. Delays imposed at the offensive's start had consumed the hours needed to reach fuel dumps that might have enabled continued advance. By December 26th, when Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne and relieved the siege, the Ardennes offensive's fate was sealed. German forces had achieved tactical penetrations but operational failure. They controlled a bulge of territory but lacked resources to exploit or even hold it. American counterattacks, supported by returned air power as weather cleared, began compressing the salient. German commanders, including Model, recognized that withdrawal was inevitable. Hitler, refusing to acknowledge reality, forbade retreat and demanded continued offensive operations with forces that no longer possessed offensive capability. The result was prolonged fighting that consumed January, ultimately returning the front to roughly its pre-offensive positions, but at staggering cost to both sides. Germany had expended its last operational reserves, achieving nothing. America had suffered heavy casualties but demonstrated resilience and adaptability that doomed any German hope of negotiated peace. Fuller, in captivity at Oflag 64 in Poland, learned fragments of this information through prison grapevine and Red Cross communications. He understood Bastogne had held, that the offensive had been contained, that the Allies were counterattacking. What he couldn't know, sitting in a POW barracks in winter Poland, was whether his regiment's stand had materially contributed to that outcome. The psychological burden of command extends beyond combat, encompassing all the decisions made and their consequences. Fuller replayed December 16th through 18th constantly, questioning each decision, wondering if different choices might have saved more lives while achieving the same mission. His officers, also captured, assured him he had done everything possible with impossible resources. This helped, but didn't eliminate the fundamental question every commander faces after costly battle. Was the price paid worth the objective gained? The answer, which would only become clear through post-war analysis, was unambiguous. The 110th Infantry Regiment's defense across its entire sector, with Clervaux as the centerpiece, had imposed delays totaling 36 to 48 hours on 2nd Panzer Division alone. Similar delays occurred across the offensive front wherever American units chose to fight rather than flee. These delays, accumulated, destroyed the German timetable irrecoverably. The Ardennes offensive failed not from any single decisive battle, but from accumulated friction, the 1,000 small delays that prevented achieving objectives rapidly enough to outrun Allied response. Clervaux was one of those friction points, significant not individually, but as part of cumulative resistance that refused to collapse despite surprise and overwhelming force. Fuller's soldiers, dying in roadblocks and cellars and castle chambers, had accomplished exactly what their orders required. They had held at all costs. The costs were terrible. The holding was decisive. Military history offers no starker example of how tactical defeat can enable strategic victory. December 18th, 2100 hours. The convoy of trucks carrying the 101st Airborne Division's final elements rolled into Bastogne through darkness and falling snow, headlights blacked out, drivers navigating by feel and memory. Captain Harry Kennard, operations officer, jumped from the lead truck and immediately began coordinating defensive positions with a competence born from multiple combat jumps in Normandy and Holland. The paratroopers, elite troops with esprit de corps bordering on arrogance, nevertheless understood they'd arrived at a desperate situation. German forces were converging on Bastogne from multiple directions. The town's defenders, a mixture of armored infantry, artillery, and stragglers from broken units, were competent but insufficient. The 101st's arrival transformed the equation, adding 5,000 veteran airborne infantry to a defensive position that controlled 7 PERMs, roads radiating through the Ardennes. Kennard, studying maps in the Belgian army barracks that became division headquarters, understood they'd arrived with perhaps 6 hours to spare before complete encirclement. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, a no-nonsense artilleryman commanding infantry through accidents of availability, established defensive perimeter with the efficiency of a man who'd planned dozens of operations and improvised dozens more. The 101st would defend Bastogne not as isolated strongpoint, but as active threat to German flanks, a fortress capable of supporting counterattacks and disrupting German logistics. McAuliffe positioned his regiments to cover all approach routes, established artillery in central location, providing support to any threatened sector, organized supply distribution to maximize ammunition availability, and coordinated with armored units for mobile reserves. This was textbook defensive organization executed under pressure with fragmentary information. What made it possible was time, measured in hours, to establish positions before German assault began in earnest. Those hours had been purchased by units like Fuller's 110th Regiment, whose stubborn defense forced German timetable delays that cascaded through the offensive. The German forces approaching Bastogne in mid-December were simultaneously powerful and depleted. Panzer Lehr Division approached from the east, 2nd Panzer Division bypassed to the north, 26th Volksgrenadier Division attacked from the south and west. Combined, these formations fielded perhaps 20,000 men and 150 tanks, overwhelming force against any normal defensive position. But Bastogne wasn't normal. The town sat on high ground dominating the surrounding terrain. The road network, essential for German logistics, converged here, making bypass impossible without accepting disastrous supply line extensions. American defenders, numbering 18,000 by December 20th, included not just infantry, but engineers, artillery, tankers, every combat arm necessary for sustained defense. German commanders, studying Bastogne's defenses through binoculars from surrounding hills, recognized they faced a choice: assault a prepared position, accepting heavy casualties, or bypass and accept a permanent threat to their supply lines. The operational timetable, already shattered, couldn't absorb either option gracefully. German decision to encircle rather than immediately assault Bastogne represented pragmatic acceptance of timeline failure. On December 19th, Panzer-Lehr Division reached Bastogne's outskirts and probed defenses. American paratroopers, fighting from hastily prepared positions, repulsed these probes with professional efficiency that surprised German commanders expecting demoralized retreating troops. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding 47th Panzer Corps, ordered his divisions to encircle Bastogne and continue advancing west, leaving reduction of the garrison to following infantry. This decision, tactically sound, strategically questionable, created the siege that became legendary. It also confirmed that German offensive momentum had evaporated. Armies that bypass strong points do so from positions of strength, confident they can continue advancing while fixing enemy forces in place. The German decision to merely encircle Bastogne revealed they lacked strength to both reduce the garrison and continue offensive simultaneously. The encirclement of Bastogne closed completely on December 20th, cutting all ground routes into the town. American forces inside, numbering roughly 18,000 combat troops plus 4,000 wounded and 5,000 civilians, faced siege conditions they hadn't fully anticipated. Supplies were adequate for perhaps 1 week if rationed carefully. Ammunition sufficient for sustained combat, maybe 3 days. Medical supplies already stretched treating casualties from the retreat into Bastogne. Weather prevented aerial resupply initially, low clouds and fog grounding transport aircraft. McAuliffe, assessing the situation with his staff, calculated odds and found them acceptable. Bastogne could hold perhaps 7 to 10 days before starvation or ammunition exhaustion forced surrender. Relief forces, he'd been told, were organizing for counterattack. The question was whether relief would arrive before garrison collapsed. This question, unanswerable in advance, determined whether Bastogne would be glorious victory or tragic defeat. On December 22nd, German forces delivered surrender ultimatum to American garrison. The message, formally phrased in the conventions of European warfare, demanded honorable capitulation to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The Germans, controlling all approaches to Bastogne, claimed they could reduce the garrison at will and were offering terms from humanitarian motives. McAuliffe, reading this ultimatum in division headquarters, responded with the word that would define his career and become synonymous with American defiance: nuts. The message, officially clarified as "go to hell" when German negotiators claimed not to understand American slang, rejected surrender absolutely. McAuliffe's reasoning was pragmatic rather than heroic. His garrison could hold longer. Relief forces were approaching. Surrendering now would accomplish nothing except providing Germans with 18,000 prisoners and eliminating a strategic threat to their supply lines. The response, delivered to German negotiators by Colonel Joseph Harper with deadpan seriousness, became instant legend among American troops and entered military mythology. The defense of Bastogne, December 20 through 26, became the most famous Battle of the Ardennes offensive through combination of strategic importance and dramatic circumstance. Surrounded garrison, refusing surrender, holding against, repeated assaults while waiting for relief played to narratives of heroic resistance that resonate across military history. Press coverage, once journalists reached the area after encirclement was broken, emphasized the paratroopers' toughness and McAuliffe's defiant response. What coverage often minimized was the broader context that made Bastogne defense possible. The garrison wasn't isolated through their own failures, but because American units to the east, including Fuller's 110th Regiment, had delayed German advance long enough for reinforcements to reach Bastogne. The siege succeeded because defenders arrived with enough time to establish positions before encirclement closed. That time was purchased with lives at Clervaux and dozen other nameless crossroads where outnumbered Americans refused to run. German prisoners, captured during Bastogne fighting, provided valuable intelligence about the offensive's deteriorating condition. Interrogations revealed fuel shortages so severe that some German units were cannibalizing vehicles to keep others operational. Ammunition stocks, while not critical, were lower than doctrine required for sustained operations. Most tellingly, morale among captured soldiers ranged from fatalistic to defeatist. Veterans understood the offensive had failed even if orders demanded continued attacks. Younger soldiers, conscripts rushed to front with minimal training, were openly terrified and privately relieved to be captured. This intelligence, compiled by Divisional G2 Section, confirmed what Bastonia's defenders suspected. They were winning not just tactically, but operationally. German forces were exhausted, culminating, losing coherence. If the garrison held just days longer, the entire German position would become untenable. Relief of Bastogne came on December 26, when Patton's Third Army, having executed a 90-degree pivot of its entire force in 48 hours, broke through German encirclement from the south. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading Third Army's attack, fought through German lines and made contact with Bastogne garrison at approximately 16:45 hours. The relief was dramatic, celebrated with cheers and embraces and photographs that captured the moment Allied fortunes decisively turned. What made relief possible was Patton's legendary logistics capability, but also the fact that German forces encircling Bastogne were too weak and fuel-starved to prevent the breakthrough. 2nd Panzer Division, the formation that might have reinforced the encirclement, was stranded west of Bastogne running out of fuel. Panzer Lehr Division, hammered by American counterattacks and attrition, lacked strength to block Third Army's advance. The delays imposed earlier in the offensive had accumulated into German inability to concentrate forces where needed most. Fuller, in POW camp, learned of Bastogne's relief through prison grapevine, news filtering through Red Cross contacts, and newly arrived prisoners. He understood then that his regiment's stand had mattered, though he couldn't yet know the specific causal chain. Bastogne holding meant the Ardennes offensive failing. The offensive failing meant Germany exhausting its last operational reserves for nothing. Those reserves exhausted meant Germany had no capability to prevent Allied advance into the fatherland. The chain of causation, visible only in retrospect, confirmed that tactical sacrifices at Clervaux had enabled strategic victory at Bastogne. Fuller's soldiers, dying in roadblocks and burning buildings, had accomplished their mission. The recognition brought no joy, only grim satisfaction that the deaths had meant something beyond immediate defeat. Military history slowly is full of heroic failures that accomplished nothing. Clervaux was heroic failure that changed everything. The difference, invisible to participants but clear to historians, separates footnote from decisive action. December 19, 1944. Henri Weyrich, the Luxembourg resistance member, who had warned Fuller of German preparations, stood in a Clervaux cellar that had become improvised headquarters for continuing operations under occupation. German forces controlled the streets above, but hadn't yet instituted the comprehensive security regime that would develop over coming weeks. This created a window, narrow and dangerous, for resistance activities that could support eventual liberation. Weyrich, meeting with 4 other resistance members in candlelight, outlined priorities with the precision of a man who'd learned underground operations during 4 years of previous occupation. They would hide American soldiers who'd evaded capture, document German atrocities for eventual war crimes prosecution, transmit intelligence on German dispositions to Allied forces, and maintain civilian morale through underground communications. Each activity risked execution if discovered. Each was necessary for Luxembourg's future and present survival. Marie-Paul Majerus, the schoolteacher who had organized her cellar shelter, became inadvertent resistance member through accident of geography and character. On December 19th, an American soldier, Private Daniel Morrison, wounded in leg and delirious with fever, knocked on her cellar door begging for shelter. Majerus, understanding that harboring enemy soldiers meant death under German occupation law, nevertheless brought Morrison inside, treated his wound with improvised medical supplies, and hid him in a concealed space behind stored preserves. Over subsequent days, 14 more American soldiers found their way to resistance safe houses, hidden by civilians whose motives mixed humanitarian impulse with pragmatic calculation that German occupation was temporary and Allied retribution for collaboration would be permanent. This calculus, never spoken aloud but understood universally, created a network of safe houses that sustained small resistance against overwhelming occupation. The resistance network operated on principles learned through previous occupation. Communication was face-to-face or through dead drops, never telephone or written message that could be intercepted. Members used code names and cell structure, preventing complete compromise if individuals were captured. Safe houses changed regularly. Americans moved every few days to prevent betrayal or accidental discovery. Food and medical supplies were obtained through black market and careful theft from German stores, every action risking exposure. The network's security depended on trust, but also paranoia, careful vetting of new members, isolation of information so individuals knew only what was necessary. This tradecraft, improvised during previous occupation and now revived, allowed resistance to function despite Gestapo presence and German military intelligence operations. German occupation forces in Clervaux faced challenges distinct from normal garrison duty. This was frontline area, supplies moving constantly toward combat units further west, discipline focused on military necessity rather than civilian control. The German commander, Major Wilhelm Schneider, was professional soldier, not Gestapo fanatic, interested primarily in maintaining order and preventing resistance from disrupting logistics. He established curfew, prohibited gatherings of more than 3 civilians, required registration of all residents, and announced harsh penalties for aiding enemy soldiers. These measures were standard occupation protocol, enforced with variable strictness depending on situation. Schneider, pragmatic about resources, couldn't spare men for comprehensive security operations when those men were needed at the front. This created gaps resistance exploited systematically. On December 22nd, resistance achieved its most significant intelligence coup. A Luxembourg postal worker, Emil Hoffmann, employed by German military postal service, photographed routing orders showing German supply routes and unit movements toward Bastogne. The photographs, taken with camera hidden in briefcase, were passed through resistance network to border region where contact with Allied intelligence still existed. This information, transmitted by clandestine radio, reached Allied intelligence on December 23rd and contributed to planning of air supply drops to Bastogne once weather cleared. The causal chain was indirect but real. Luxembourg resistance intelligence improved Allied understanding of German logistics, enabling more effective targeting of supply interdiction. Hoffmann's courage, demonstrated by continuing intelligence gathering despite knowing discovery meant execution, exemplified resistance, motivation, mixing patriotism with calculation that only Allied victory guaranteed survival. The documentation of German atrocities became resistance priority after civilians discovered mass grave at Betborn containing bodies of American soldiers executed after surrender. Resistance members photographed the scene, carefully noting details that would enable identification and prosecution. They interviewed witnesses, including Alphonse Wolff, who had watched the massacre from his barn. They preserved physical evidence, shell casings, and personal effects, hiding them for eventual presentation to authorities. This documentation work was driven partly by moral outrage, but also by practical understanding that war crimes evidence would be valuable in post-war reckoning. Luxembourg, small nation repeatedly occupied by larger powers, understood that memory and documentation were weapons when physical resistance was impossible. Execution risk for resistance members was not theoretical. On December 28th, Gestapo arrested 3 civilians in Clervaux suspected of aiding American evaders. The evidence was circumstantial, based on anonymous denunciation and suspicion rather than proof, but occupation law didn't require proof beyond reasonable doubt. The 3 civilians, 2 men and 1 woman, were executed by firing squad on December 30th after summary trial that lasted 15 minutes. Their bodies were left in town square for 3 days as warning. Resistance members, attending the covert burial after German authorities finally allowed removal, understood viscerally what they risked. Yet the network continued operating, driven by conviction that occupation was temporary and that whatever dangers they faced would be rewarded when liberation came. This calculation proved correct, but only for those who survived to see liberation. Christmas 1944 in Clervaux was observed in cellars and makeshift chapels, civilians maintaining religious traditions despite occupation. Marie-Paule Majerus organized Christmas Eve Mass in her cellar. 30 civilians and 3 hidden American soldiers attending ceremony conducted by whispered liturgy and prayers offered for liberation. The incongruity was absolute, celebrating birth of Prince of Peace while shells periodically impacted above, singing carols about hope while living in circumstances of despair. Yet the ceremony mattered, preserving humanity and normalcy in conditions designed to strip both. The Americans, unused to Catholic liturgy but moved by its solemnity, participated awkwardly but sincerely. Private Morrison, the wounded soldier Majerus had hidden, wept during the service, overwhelmed by civilian courage in his own survival against odds. These moments, small and private and unrecorded except in memory, demonstrated that resistance wasn't only armed struggle but preservation of values against forces trying to extinguish them. By January 1945, Resistance Network had successfully evacuated 15 American soldiers to Allied lines, documented 11 separate war crimes for eventual prosecution, and transmitted dozens of intelligence reports on German movements. The success rate, 15 soldiers saved from perhaps 40 who'd evaded capture initially, was incomplete but significant. Each saved soldier was an intelligence source providing information on German tactics and dispositions. Each documented atrocity was evidence that would eventually secure convictions. Each intelligence report contributed marginally to Allied operational understanding. The resistance impact was asymmetric, small actions creating disproportionate effects, demonstrating that even occupied populations could affect outcomes when properly organized and motivated. Luxembourg resistance during Clervaux occupation never achieved the scale of French Maquis or Yugoslav partisans, but it achieved results proportionate to its capabilities, proving that even tiny nations could resist totalitarian power if citizens accepted personal risk for collective benefit. December 22, 1944, 0900 hours. General George Patton stood in 3rd Army Headquarters War Room, studying maps covered with acetate overlays showing unit positions, supply routes, and objectives for the counterattack he'd been ordered to execute with impossible speed. Eisenhower had given him 72 hours to disengage 3 divisions from offensive operations in Saarland sector, pivot 90 degrees north, and attack into the southern shoulder of German penetration to relieve Bastogne. This was logistical nightmare requiring movement of 90,000 men, 25,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies over icy roads while maintaining combat effectiveness. Patton, whose public persona emphasized aggressive confidence, privately understood this was the most complex operation he'd commanded. Success required not just moving divisions, but doing so while maintaining cohesion, communication, supply. His staff, working continuously since December 19th, had produced movement plans that looked feasible on paper. Reality would determine if theory translated to execution. The weather, which had favored Germans during the offensive's initial phase by grounding Allied aircraft, finally cleared on December 23rd. Patton, standing outside headquarters watching P-47 fighters taking off from nearby airfield, felt the situation shifting. Allied air superiority, absolute when weather-permitted operations, was a devastating weapon against German forces whose supply lines stretched across exposed terrain. Fighter bombers attacked anything moving on German-controlled roads, destroying trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons with equal efficiency. The interdiction effect was cumulative, each destroyed supply vehicle slightly worsening German logistics crisis, each delay slightly extending time required for operations. Patton, watching his own forces advance under protective air cover while German forces cowered from aerial assault, understood that weather clearing sealed German defeat. The offensive had depended on maintaining momentum before Allied superiority could be brought to bear. That window had closed. Allied intelligence, analyzing intercepts and prisoner interrogations, constructed picture of German offensive degrading toward collapse. Ultra-intercepts showed German commanders requesting permission to withdraw to defensible positions, requests denied by Hitler's headquarters with orders to continue attacking. These intercepts revealed desperation and disarray, units reporting fuel exhaustion, casualties mounting, objectives unachievable. Prisoner interrogations confirmed the intercepted messages, German soldiers describing chaotic conditions, supplies not arriving, leadership making increasingly unrealistic demands. The composite intelligence picture showed German offensive culminating, losing coherence, transforming from coordinated operation to series of isolated attacks by exhausted units. Allied intelligence officers, briefing senior commanders, delivered assessments that offensive had been contained, and German forces were vulnerable to counterattack. This assessment, accurate but incomplete, missed the broader strategic point. The offensive had failed not from any single engagement, but from accumulated delays that prevented achieving objectives before Allied response organized. Third Army's counterattack, launched December 22nd, represented American military logistics and coordination at their most effective. 3 full divisions, roughly 45,000 combat troops supported by armor and artillery, pivoted from offensive operations in one sector to relief operations in another, with minimal loss of combat effectiveness. This required moving entire supply echelon, repositioning artillery batteries, establishing new communications networks, coordinating with air support, shifted from other sectors. The complexity was staggering, managed through professional staff work and hard-won experience from 2 years of campaigning. Patton's role was providing command vision and accepting risk, driving operations forward despite incomplete information and uncertain enemy dispositions. His subordinate commanders, division, and corps leaders executed the tactical details with competence born from experience. The result was textbook example of operational art, moving large formations rapidly while maintaining readiness to fight immediately upon arrival. German forces facing Third Army's advance were positioned for offensive operations, not defensive. Their dispositions favored continuation of westward advance, leaving southern flank thinly protected with assumption that American forces wouldn't counterattack while dealing with major breakthrough. This assumption, reasonable given initial American disarray, proved catastrophic as Patton's forces struck positions held by second-rate units without armor or adequate anti-tank weapons. The German 7th Army, responsible for southern shoulder of penetration, had been economy of force assignment, minimal troops holding, while main effort focused on driving toward Meuse. Now that economy of force sector became decisive, as Third Army's advance threatened to cut off all German forces in the penetration by severing their supply lines. German command recognized the danger and attempted to reposition reserves to block Patton, but reserves were already committed to Bastogne fighting or stranded without fuel. The flexibility that armored warfare required had been consumed by delays earlier in the offensive. On December 26th, 4th Armored Division, spearheading Third Army's attack, broke through to Bastogne after 4 days of intense combat. The breakthrough was narrow, creating corridor under constant German fire, but sufficient to allow supply convoys to reach the garrison and wounded to be evacuated. The relief of Bastogne broke German offensive operationally and psychologically. Operationally, it removed the garrison as immediate threat and freed forces for continued counterattack. Psychologically, it demonstrated that American forces had recovered from initial surprise and were now dictating operational tempo. German commanders, briefing their superiors on the situation, used carefully euphemistic language. Forward movement has been temporarily halted. Consolidating gains, preparing defensive positions. The translation was obvious. The offensive had failed. By December 28th, German forces were effectively retreating. Though Hitler's headquarters refused to authorize official withdrawal, units pulled back from their furthest penetrations, abandoning equipment they lacked fuel to move, fighting delaying actions against American advances from multiple directions. The Ardennes penetration, which at its deepest had extended 50 miles into Allied lines, began contracting as American counterattacks compressed it from all sides. The fighting during this withdrawal phase was vicious, German forces conducting professional retrograde operations, while American forces pursued cautiously, aware that cornered units fought desperately. Casualties on both sides remained high even as strategic outcome became clear. This fighting, extending into January 1945, produced thousands more casualties, achieving what both sides recognized was inevitable: return to approximately the pre-offensive front lines. The strategic consequences of the Ardennes offensive extended far beyond the battle itself. Germany had expended its last operational reserves, approximately 100,000 casualties, including the elite panzer divisions that had been hoarded for this offensive. These forces couldn't be replaced. German industry, despite miraculous production efforts under bombing, couldn't manufacture tanks faster than they were being destroyed. German manpower reserves were exhausted, recruiting now reaching to 16-year-old boys and older men previously considered unfit. The offensive had been Germany's last chance to change the war's trajectory. Its failure guaranteed that Allied advance into Germany would proceed without effective German operational-level resistance. Hitler, refusing to acknowledge this reality, continued ordering impossible counteroffensives and holding operations. But his generals, reading casualty reports and logistics summaries, understood the war was effectively over, even if fighting continued. American casualties in the Ardennes, roughly 80,000 killed, wounded, and captured, were heavy but sustainable. The American replacement system, though imperfect, could provide new soldiers to fill depleted units. American industry was producing weapons and equipment in quantities that dwarfed German production. Most critically, American will to continue fighting remained solid, strengthened rather than weakened by German aggression. The offensive, intended to split Allied coalition and force negotiated peace, had instead unified Allied determination and demonstrated that German military power, though still dangerous, was fundamentally broken. This psychological effect, difficult to quantify but strategically significant, ensured that final campaigns into Germany would proceed with confidence rather than caution. Fuller, learning of these developments through prison grapevine and Red Cross communications, finally understood his regiment's place in this narrative. The delays at Clervaux and across the 110th Regiment sector had been part of a larger pattern of American resistance that had disrupted German timetable fatally. His soldiers hadn't stopped the offensive, but they'd delayed it long enough for Allied response to organize. That delay, purchased with lives, had been decisive. The psychological burden of command that Fuller carried, the weight of decisions that sent men to probable death, was partially lifted by understanding those deaths had accomplished their mission. It didn't make the losses acceptable or the grief less, but it provided meaning, the understanding that sacrifice hadn't been wasted. In war's brutal accounting, meaning is sometimes all that can be salvaged from tragedy. January 26, 1945. The 5th Infantry Division, advancing eastward as Allied forces compressed the Ardennes salient, reached Clervaux's outskirts at dawn. German forces, conducting fighting withdrawal toward their border, had evacuated the town overnight, leaving only rearguard detachments to cover the retreat. American infantry, entering cautiously expecting resistance, instead found silence and devastation. Clervaux, medieval town of 8 centuries, had been transformed into moonscape of rubble and burned buildings. Of 680 structures standing on December 15th, 472 showed damage ranging from shell holes to complete destruction. The castle, dominating the hill, remained standing but gutted by fire, its stone walls scarred by countless impacts. The bridge over the Clervaux River, demolition charges attached but never detonated, stood intact, ironic memorial to battles that had raged around it. The advancing Americans, veterans of months of combat, nevertheless paused at the destruction, understanding that what they saw was evidence of battle fought with desperate intensity by both sides. Marie-Paul Majerus heard American voices speaking English and emerged from her cellar after 39 days of occupation and siege. The sight that greeted her was simultaneously liberating and devastating. American soldiers, young and exhausted, and clearly moved by what they found, were clearing streets and searching buildings. Dead German soldiers lay where they'd fallen, rearguard troops killed in night skirmish. Destroyed German equipment lined streets, testimony to air attacks that had hammered retreating forces. Majerus, blinking in daylight that seemed impossibly bright after weeks underground, felt emotions she couldn't articulate: relief at liberation, horror at destruction, grief for neighbors who hadn't survived, rage at waste and pointlessness of it all. An American officer, captain perhaps 25 years old, approached and asked in careful French if she was injured, if others needed medical help, if she knew location of German mines or booby traps. She responded mechanically, providing information, guiding soldiers to cellars where civilians and wounded Americans still sheltered. The recovery of hidden American soldiers became priority for counterintelligence corps detachments accompanying the advance. Marie-Paul led them to Private Morrison, the wounded soldier she'd hidden for 38 days, now walking with improvised crutch but alive and coherent. Morrison, seeing American uniforms, wept openly, unable to articulate gratitude to the civilians who'd risked execution to save him. Across Clervaux, similar scenes repeated as resistance members guided Americans to safe houses containing evaders. 11 Americans were recovered alive, their survival testimony to Luxembourg's civilian courage. 4 more were found dead, succumbed to wounds or killed when their hiding places were discovered. Each survivor represented intelligence source, first-hand account of German occupation, witness to events that would be compiled into after-action reports. Each dead soldier represented tragedy, but also documentation of civilian sacrifice, evidence that would support post-war recognition of Luxembourg resistance contributions. Counterintelligence Corps investigators, arriving with advance forces, began documenting evidence of atrocities committed during the battle and occupation. The mass grave at Betborn was exhumed, bodies identified through dog tags and personal effects, photographs taken for eventual war crimes, prosecution. Alphonse Wolff, the farmer who had witnessed the massacre, provided detailed testimony that would prove crucial in securing convictions. Similar investigations proceeded at other sites where resistance members reported executions or civilian deaths under suspicious circumstances. The documentation was methodical and professional, building cases that would be presented at war crimes trials in 1946 and 47. This work, unglamorous but necessary, ensured that atrocities wouldn't be forgotten or dismissed as fog of war. The photographs, witness statements, and physical evidence would become historical record, proof that certain acts crossed lines even in warfare's moral ambiguity. The castle, inspected by American engineers, was deemed structurally sound despite heavy damage. The medieval walls, 3 to 4 feet thick, had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed modern construction. Interior was different story, fire having gutted furnished chambers and destroyed much of the roof. The photography collection that Castle had housed, Edward Steichen's early work on The Family of Man exhibition, had suffered significant losses but partial survival. Engineers reported that restoration would be possible, though expensive and time-consuming. The castle administrator, who'd begged Fuller to evacuate artifacts, returned from refuge in Belgium and surveyed the damage with stoic acceptance. Some pieces were lost forever, others survived through chance. The castle itself, most important artifact, remained standing. Luxembourg's government in exile, informed of the damage, began planning restoration that would eventually create a museum commemorating both medieval heritage and 20th century battles. Civilians emerging from cellars began the grim accounting of losses. 87 residents of Clervaux had died during the battle and occupation, killed by artillery, caught in crossfire, executed for resistance activities, or succumbing to privation. This represented roughly 5% of pre-battle population, catastrophic loss for small community where everyone knew everyone. Families searched rubble for possessions, finding occasional intact item among destruction, more often finding nothing but debris. The psychological impact of seeing homes transformed to ruins was profound, even for civilians who'd expected destruction. Hope that somehow their specific house might have been spared died confronting reality of damage too extensive to deny. American civil affairs officers, accompanying the Liberation Force, began organizing relief supplies and temporary shelter. But supplies were limited. Temporary was likely to be months or years, and nobody had answers about when or how reconstruction would proceed. The chapel service held in Castle Courtyard on January 28th brought together American soldiers, Luxembourg civilians, and resistance members in commemoration, mixing grief with gratitude. The chaplain, Captain Robert Anderson, spoke about sacrifice and liberation, about those who died defending and those who died resisting, about hope that their deaths would mean something in world being born from war's devastation. Marie-Paul Majerus, asked to speak for the civilians, talked about the American soldiers who'd fought for town they had never seen before, who'd treated civilians as allies rather than obstacles, who'd given lives to purchase time for others. Her voice broke describing the defense, the castle standing against overwhelming force, the knowledge that Americans were dying above while civilians sheltered below. She concluded simply, they'd been together in this, soldiers and civilians, defenders and protected, and together they'd survived what neither could have survived alone. The service ended with prayer in multiple languages, English and French and Luxembourgish, acknowledgement that some experiences transcend language. The documentation of physical destruction continued for weeks as assessment teams cataloged damage. 69% of structures destroyed or heavily damaged. Infrastructure, including water, electricity, and sewage systems, comprehensively wrecked. Roads cratered by artillery. Bridge intact, but approaches damaged. Castle defensible, but uninhabitable. Churches damaged. Their medieval windows shattered by concussion. The inventory was exhaustive and depressing, each line item representing someone's home or livelihood or treasured inheritance. The cost in currency was calculated at millions, though exact figures were complicated by property whose value couldn't be assessed in money. The Luxembourg government, reconstituted in exile, began negotiating with allies for reconstruction assistance. But resources were limited, priorities competed, and Clervaux's rebuilding would proceed slowly over years rather than months. Some residents never returned, relocating to cities or emigrating, unable to rebuild from such comprehensive loss. American military authorities established temporary administration in Clervaux as part of broader civil affairs operations in liberated Luxembourg. The occupying forces, 4th Infantry Division units rotating through for rest after sustained combat, were simultaneously conquerors and guests, liberators complicated by the practical necessities of military presence. Soldiers billeted in surviving structures, their presence reassuring, but also reminder that liberation didn't mean return to normalcy. Civilians, grateful for liberation, nevertheless chafed at military restrictions necessary for security. The relationship was generally positive, but complicated by language barriers, different expectations, and simple friction of military force operating in civilian space. American commanders, aware of these complications, instituted policies to minimize friction while maintaining necessary security. The result was imperfect coexistence that satisfied neither side completely but functioned adequately during transition from combat to reconstruction. The final American assessment of Clervaux battle, compiled by regimental historians interviewing survivors and studying after-action reports, concluded that the defense had imposed approximately 36 to 48 hours delay on 2nd Panzer Division's advance. This delay, combined with similar delays across the offensive front, had prevented Germans from reaching Bastogne before significant reinforcements arrived. The defense was therefore strategically successful, despite tactical defeat, accomplishing the mission implied in Fuller's orders to hold at all costs. The assessment, dry and professional, didn't capture the human dimensions of what that meant. But it provided official validation that the sacrifice hadn't been wasted. Fuller, still in POW camp when this assessment was compiled, would eventually read it and find some measure of peace in its conclusions. His soldiers had done their jobs. Their deaths had mattered. In war's brutal accounting, that was sometimes the best outcome available. Spring 1945. War crimes investigation teams fanned across liberated Europe, documenting atrocities that international law would eventually address through tribunals. In Clervaux sector, investigators exhumed mass graves, photographed execution sites, interviewed witnesses whose testimony would be crucial for prosecution. The work was systematic and grim, building legal cases from physical evidence and witness statements. At Betborn, investigators documented the massacre of 8 American medics and 6 wounded soldiers, matching testimony from Alphonse Wolff with physical evidence including spent shell casings and personal effects recovered from bodies. At 4 other sites across the 110th Regiment sector, similar documentation proceeded for executions of American prisoners. The investigators, mostly lawyers in uniform, approached their work with professional detachment that concealed emotional impact. These weren't historical exercises, but preparation for legal proceedings that would determine individual culpability for war crimes. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Bernhardt, the SS officer who had ordered the Betborn massacre, was captured by American forces in April 1945 near Nuremberg. His interrogation, conducted by officers who documented the crimes he'd ordered, was professional but intense. Bernhardt initially denied involvement, claiming confusion about dates and locations. Confronted with Wolff's testimony and physical evidence, he admitted presence but claimed he'd been following superior orders to show no mercy to Franc-tireurs and irregular forces. The interrogators, familiar with this defense from dozens of previous cases, noted his statements without comment. The case against Bernhardt would be presented at Dachau war crimes trials in 1947. His conviction, secured partially through Wolf's testimony, resulted in death sentence executed by hanging in December 1947. The justice was delayed but delivered, acknowledgement that even in war's chaos, certain acts carried consequences. Fuller's liberation came in May 1945 when Soviet forces overran Oflag, 64 in Poland. His captivity had lasted 5 months, much of it spent in relative comfort of officer POW camp, where Geneva Convention protections were observed more faithfully than in camps for enlisted prisoners. Fuller had used captivity to compile notes on the Clervaux defense, interviewing fellow prisoners who'd served in the 110th Regiment, reconstructing timeline and decisions from collective memory. The resulting document, never officially published but preserved in military archives, provided detailed account of the battle from commander's perspective. Fuller's liberation, followed by months of debriefing and medical evaluation, eventually led to his return to United States in August 1945. He was 45 years old, physically healthy, but emotionally scarred by experiences he had processed for the remainder of his life. The Distinguished Service Cross, second highest military decoration for valor, was awarded to Fuller in ceremony at Pentagon in October 1945. The citation recognized his leadership during Clervaux defense, specifically noting that his tactical skill and personal courage in the face of overwhelming enemy forces resulted in significant delay of German offensive operations. Fuller, accepting the medal, gave brief remarks thanking his soldiers and expressing hope that their sacrifice would be remembered. He didn't mention his own doubts about decisions made, the second-guessing that accompanied every commander after costly battle. The ceremony was public recognition of professional competence under extreme circumstances. What it couldn't address was the personal burden Fuller carried, the faces of men who had died following his orders, the question of whether different decisions might have achieved the mission with fewer casualties. These questions, inherent to command, had no answers available from military decorations or official recognitions. The regimental history of the 110th Infantry Regiment, compiled by military historians using official records and veteran interviews, characterized the Clervaux defense as a classic example of delay tactics executed under the most adverse conditions. The history noted that the regiment suffered approximately 2,500 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, from December 16th through 18th. This represented near total destruction of the regiment as an effective fighting force. The casualties were disproportionately concentrated among infantry and anti-tank units, the soldiers who'd held roadblocks and street positions during the fighting. The history concluded that the regiment's defense, while tactically defeated, had achieved strategic success by imposing delays that contributed materially to failure of the German offensive. This assessment, validated through post-war analysis of German records, provided official acknowledgement of the defense's importance. German records captured and analyzed by Allied intelligence confirmed American assessments about the offensive's timeline problems. 2nd Panzer Division's War Diary noted that delays at Clervaux had prevented the division from reaching planned positions by 36 to 48 hours. Operations orders from 47th Panzer Corps showed progressive revision of objectives as actual progress fell behind planned schedule. Hitler's headquarters dispatches, increasingly unhinged as the offensive failed, blamed field commanders for lack of will and determination, refusing to acknowledge that logistics and timeline made objectives impossible regardless of willpower. The composite German record painted picture of offensive undone by accumulated delays rather than any single decisive engagement. Clervaux appeared in these records as one of multiple friction points that, combined, destroyed the operational plan. The investigation into German fuel logistics revealed how critically timing affected the offensive's viability. German forces had sufficient fuel for approximately 4 days of operations at planned consumption rates. They had anticipated capturing American dumps to sustain operations beyond that point. The delays imposed across the offensive front meant those dumps were either destroyed by retreating Americans or remained behind unconquered American strongpoints. By December 20th, German forces were operating on fumes, some units literally pushing tanks with crews because they lacked fuel to drive them. This fuel crisis, predictable from the start, given German logistics capabilities, was manageable only if objectives were reached on schedule. The timeline collapse, caused by accumulated delays including Clervaux, transformed manageable logistics challenge into catastrophic failure that stopped the offensive regardless of tactical situation. The human cost of Clervaux defense extended beyond battle casualties to include long-term trauma among survivors. Veterans of the fighting reported higher rates of what would later be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, manifesting as nightmares, startle responses, difficulty with civilian adjustment. The intensity of combat, the high casualty rates, and the knowledge that many friends died while they survived created psychological burdens that many carried for the remainder of their lives. The Veterans Administration, still developing understanding of combat trauma, provided limited support. Veterans groups, formed by 110th Regiment survivors, became informal support networks where men could discuss experiences with others who understood. These groups, meeting for decades after the war, provided space for processing shared trauma that civilian society couldn't fully comprehend. The posthumous recognition of soldiers killed at Clervaux proceeded through various channels. 23 men received Silver Stars for valor, awarded based on witness testimony about specific acts of courage under fire. 37 received Bronze Stars. 2 received posthumous Distinguished Service Crosses. Lieutenant Raymond Flegg, killed at his anti-tank gun in Marnock, received Silver Star recognizing that his position's resistance had destroyed multiple German tanks and delayed the advance for hours. These awards, distributed to families years after the deaths they recognized, provided official acknowledgement of sacrifice. Whether they provided comfort to grieving families was individual and unknowable. Some families treasured the medals as tangible connection to lost sons and husbands. Others found them inadequate substitutes for the lives taken. The military, having no better way to recognize sacrifice, continued the practice despite its limitations. The final accounting of Clervaux battle's strategic impact came through comparative analysis of timeline and outcomes. Historians calculated that delays imposed across the 110th Regiment sector, including but not limited to Clervaux itself, totaled 36 to 60 hours against German planned schedule. These delays cascaded through the offensive, preventing panzer divisions from reaching Bastogne before significant reinforcement, exhausting fuel before objectives were reached, allowing Allied air power to return as weather cleared. No single delay was decisive. The accumulation proved fatal to German plans. Clervaux, as the most sustained single defensive action, contributed substantially to this accumulation. The academic debate about how critical this specific battle was would continue for decades. But consensus emerged that Clervaux represented significant delay action that materially affected the offensive's outcome. For the soldiers who fought there, this acknowledgement validated their sacrifice. For historians, it demonstrated how tactical actions, even defeats, could enable strategic victory through effects on time and space that participants couldn't see but commanders exploited. 1954. 10 years after the battle, a small ceremony gathered in Clervaux Castle's reconstructed courtyard. 42 American veterans of the 110th Infantry Regiment stood in formation, older now, their dress uniforms carefully preserved from mothballs and memory. Colonel Hurley Fuller, retired and teaching history at a Pennsylvania college, delivered remarks to an audience of Luxembourg civilians, American officials, and local dignitaries. His voice carried across the courtyard where he had made his last stand a decade earlier. He spoke about the castle, rebuilt through Luxembourg government funding and American contributions, now housing photography museum and war memorial. He spoke about the soldiers who had fought here, most of whom couldn't attend because they were dead or too wounded or simply too far away. He spoke about memory, about how battles are remembered or forgotten, not through objective importance but through narrative convenience. Bastogne, he noted carefully, had become legend. Clervaux had become footnote. Both battles mattered, only one captured public imagination. The disconnect between historical significance and popular memory troubled veterans who gathered at these reunions. Staff Sergeant Grant Yeager, who had survived his Sherman being destroyed, attended with visible prosthetic hand replacing the one lost in the explosion. He spoke quietly with other survivors about frustration that their battle received minimal recognition. Newspapers covered Bastogne anniversaries extensively. Clervaux merited brief mentions if acknowledged at all. The disparity seemed unjust to men who'd fought with equal determination against worse odds. But they understood, with the wisdom that comes from surviving what kills others, that history remembers what serves narrative needs. Bastogne had dramatic elements: surrounded garrison, famous commander, one-word response to surrender demand. Clervaux had scattered defensive actions, colonel captured, gradual defeat purchasing time. One story wrote itself, the other required explanation. Public attention followed the easier narrative. The media coverage patterns confirm this disparity starkly. Researchers analyzing post-war newspapers and magazines found Bastogne mentioned in over 1,400 articles between 1945 and 1960. Clervaux appeared in fewer than 100, usually as brief mention in broader Ardennes offensive coverage. Popular histories, proliferating as war memoirs, began this publishing phenomenon, devoted chapters to Bastogne, while Clervaux received paragraphs. The pattern wasn't conspiracy, but human nature. Readers wanted heroes winning against odds, not competent soldiers dying while doing their jobs. McAuliffe's nuts response provided quotable defiance. Fuller's professional defense of untenable position provided military case study. Popular audiences preferred the former. Military professionals studied the latter. The division between public memory and professional assessment created strange situation where battle's significance was acknowledged in military schools but unknown to broader public. Fuller's own post-war career reflected this memory divide. He retired from Army in 1946, took position teaching military history at small college, published academic articles on defensive tactics, but never wrote popular memoir. His students, learning about Ardennes' offensive, knew Bastogne intimately and Clervaux barely. Fuller, teaching about his own battle, maintained professional detachment that concealed personal investment. He presented Clervaux as case study in economy of force, delay tactics, cost-benefit calculations in defensive operations. His lectures were dry, academic, deliberately focused on doctrine rather than drama. Only occasionally, usually in office hours with students genuinely interested in tactical details, would he discuss personal dimension, what it felt like making decisions that sent men to probable death, how he carried those faces with him, why he'd declined to write memoir that might have brought recognition. He told one student that some experiences were too important to be reduced to entertainment. The comment, preserved in students' notes, captured Fuller's fundamental conflict with popular memory's demands. The veterans themselves processed their experience through reunion culture that became increasingly important as decades passed. The 110th Infantry Regiment Association, formed in 1948, held annual reunions that drew dozens of survivors initially. Fewer as years brought death and disability. These gatherings weren't celebrations, but commemorations, opportunities to discuss experiences with men who understood without explanation. Conversations at reunions touched on tactical details, remembered commanders, specific firefights. They also addressed deeper themes: survivor guilt, meaning of sacrifice, whether their stand had mattered. The consensus, formed through years of discussion and reflection, was that they'd done their jobs as well as humanly possible under impossible conditions. Whether the broader world recognized this was ultimately irrelevant. They knew. Their families knew. The judgment that mattered came from within their community of shared experience. Luxembourg's treatment of Clervaux battle contrasted markedly with American neglect. The castle, restored through 1950s, became national memorial, recognizing both medieval heritage and 20th century sacrifice. The Luxembourg government established December 16th as Remembrance Day, annual ceremony honoring American defenders and civilian victims. Streets were named for American units that fought there. A monument in town square listed American soldiers killed defending Luxembourg, permanent reminder of foreign soldiers who died for Luxembourg freedom. This recognition, sincere and sustained, meant that in Luxembourg, Clervaux wasn't forgotten. American veterans, attending Luxembourg ceremonies, found appreciation they didn't receive in their own country. The irony wasn't lost on them. They were heroes abroad, footnotes at home. The military education community, in contrast to popular neglect, studied Clervaux extensively. The Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth included Clervaux defense as case study and curriculum, beginning in 1960s. The tactical problems it presented, defending with inadequate forces, imposing maximum delay, calculating acceptable casualties, were precisely the problems junior officers needed to understand. Student officers analyzed Fuller's decisions, debated alternatives, calculated whether different tactics might have achieved similar delay with lower casualties. The debates were academic, but rooted in professional reality. Every officer might someday face similar impossible situations. Clervaux provided historical example of how professional soldiers handled such circumstances. The case-study approach, focused on decision-making process rather than heroic narrative, ensured that military professionals learned from Clervaux even as public forgot it. The publication of SLA Marshall's official history of the Ardennes campaign in 1962 provided first comprehensive account of Clervaux battle in widely available format. Marshall, controversial military historian known for methodical veteran interviews, had spoken with dozens of Clervaux survivors while compiling his account. His assessment was unambiguous. The defense of Clervaux materially delayed the German advance and contributed significantly to the failure of the offensive's initial phase. Marshall's history, widely read in military circles, brought professional recognition to the battle, even as it failed to penetrate popular consciousness. The disconnect illustrated fundamental division in how military history functions. Professionals study what's instructive, public remembers what's emotionally satisfying. Clervaux was instructive. Bastogne was satisfying. Both were important, but they served different audiences and purposes. By the 1970s, as Vietnam War transformed American relationship with military history, Clervaux battle acquired different resonance. The idea of soldiers fighting competently in losing causes, sacrificing themselves for strategic objectives they couldn't see, resonated with Vietnam veterans processing their own experiences. Clervaux became example of how tactical defeats could enable strategic objectives, how soldiers could fulfill missions even while being overwhelmed, how professional performance mattered regardless of immediate outcomes. This interpretation, reading Clervaux through Vietnam lens, wasn't necessarily what World War II veterans recognized in their experience, but it provided framework for new generation to understand that military effectiveness isn't synonymous with tactical victory. The lesson, uncomfortable but important, was that sometimes soldiers' job is losing well rather than winning. Fuller died in 1972 at age 72 of heart failure. His obituary in the New York Times ran 3 paragraphs, mentioning his Distinguished Service Cross and teaching career, but providing minimal detail about Clervaux. The military history community mourned more extensively, with articles in professional journals recognizing his tactical competence and personal integrity. Fuller's papers, donated to Army Heritage and Education Center, included his personal notes from POW camp, reconstructed timeline of the battle, and correspondence with survivors. Historians mining these papers found evidence of man who'd carried his command decisions seriously, questioned himself extensively, but ultimately accepted that he'd done his professional best. His legacy, within military education circles, was secure even if public recognition remained minimal. For Fuller, that professional respect from those who understood command's burdens was probably the recognition that mattered most. The memory question, why some battles are remembered while others fade, has no satisfying answer beyond acknowledging that narrative shapes memory more than significance determines it. Clervaux mattered strategically, but lacked dramatic narrative elements that create lasting memory. It was important battle that wasn't particularly good story, at least not in formats popular audiences consumed. The veterans understood this, accepted it with varying degrees of peace, and focused on ensuring that within their community and families, the memory survived. Their reunions, growing smaller each year, maintained oral tradition that supplemented sparse written record. By century's end, with most veterans dead, that oral tradition would largely disappear. But the written record, preserved in archives and military histories, would ensure that future military professionals could study Clervaux's lessons. Public memory and professional memory serve different functions. Clervaux endured in the latter, even as it faded from the former, testimony to battle's significance for those trained to recognize it. Present day. A visitor standing in Clervaux Castle's tower, looking east toward the German border just 3 miles away, can still trace the approach routes 2nd Panzer Division used in December 1944. Route 18 runs through the valley below, the same road that funneled German armor toward American defenders. The castle itself, meticulously restored, houses the photography museum and war memorial Fuller had helped dedicate in 1954. The medieval architecture, 8 centuries old, shows minimal evidence of the battle that raged here. Stone walls, pocked by shell impacts then repaired, have weathered 79 more years. The tower where Fuller stood making impossible decisions now hosts tourists photographing Luxembourg countryside. The Great Hall where his command post operated displays the Family of Man photography exhibition, Edward Steichen's masterwork about universal human experience. The juxtaposition is almost too perfect. Art about humanity's commonalities displayed in Fortress where men killed each other over 3 days of concentrated violence. The question that haunts anyone who studies Clervaux battle closely is whether it actually mattered, whether the 36 to 48 hours of delay Fuller's regiment imposed changed anything beyond its own destruction. The counterfactual is impossible to prove but compelling to consider. What if Clervaux had fallen quickly, as German planners expected? 2nd Panzer Division would have reached Bastogne area perhaps 36 hours earlier, on evening of December 17th, rather than noon December 19th. The 101st Airborne Division arrived Bastogne on December 18th, around 2100 hours. The timeline suggests that earlier German arrival might have reached Bastogne before significant reinforcement, facing perhaps 1 or 2 battalions instead of a division. The defensive perimeter that held Bastogne would not have existed. German forces, bypassing weakly held town, could have continued west toward the Meuse River. Whether they would have succeeded, given fuel limitations, remains debatable. But the possibility that Clervaux's delay enabled Bastogne's defense isn't speculation, but reasoned conclusion from timeline analysis. The mathematics of military operations, often invisible to participants, become clear through historical analysis. 2nd Panzer Division's war diary shows the unit consumed 48 hours between crossing the Our River and clearing Clervaux area, reaching Erspelt west of town on December 18th evening. The planned timeline showed this same phase requiring 12 hours maximum. The 36-hour difference resulted from accumulated delays at Marnock, Hossingen, Clervaux itself, and smaller roadblocks throughout the sector. These delays weren't accidents or German incompetence, but direct results of American defensive decisions. Fuller's choice to hold rather than retreat, his positioning of forces to maximize delay, his sacrifice of units to buy hours, created the friction that destroyed German schedule. The causal chain from tactical decision to strategic outcome is rarely so clear. Clervaux provides textbook example of how operational art translates individual actions into campaign-level effects. Fuller's initial assessment, delivered to his officers on December 16th, was that they could hold 24 to 48 hours maximum against forces opposing them. His estimate proved exactly correct. The regiment held approximately 40 hours across its entire sector, concentrating into Clervaux for final stand that lasted until December 18th morning. Fuller's professional judgment, based on doctrine and experience, had accurately calculated what was possible with forces available. The fact that maximum possible aligned with strategically necessary was fortunate accident rather than planned precision. Fuller couldn't have known that 36 hours would prove critical. He only knew he was ordered to hold as long as possible. That coincidence of mission requirement and capability limit suggests that sometimes tactical commanders, executing impossible orders with grim professionalism, accomplish exactly what strategic situation requires without understanding the broader context. The cost paid for those 36 hours was measured in lives and futures destroyed. The 110th Infantry Regiment lost 2,500 men killed, wounded, or captured from initial strength of 3,000. This represented functional annihilation of the regiment as combat unit. The survivors, those who lived through Clervaux and eventual liberation or POW camp repatriation, carried physical and psychological scars for the remainder of their lives. The families, Of the killed received telegrams delivering news that destroyed futures and created grief that never fully healed. The Luxembourg civilians caught in the battle lost homes, relatives, years of their lives to occupation and reconstruction. The German soldiers who fought against them suffered their own casualties and trauma, victims of war they didn't start but were required to fight. The total human cost was incalculable in traditional metrics because it included not just immediate casualties, but decades of diminished lives and unrealized potentials. Whether this cost was worth it depends entirely on whose perspective frames the question. From strategic standpoint focused on Allied victory, the cost was justified by contribution to defeating the German offensive and shortening the war. From perspective of individual soldier bleeding out in a Clervaux street, dying to purchase hours he didn't know mattered, the strategic justification was abstract and irrelevant. From viewpoint of families who lost sons and husbands, no strategic benefit could compensate for personal loss. War's brutal reality is that these perspectives can't be reconciled into comfortable synthesis. The battle was both justified strategically and tragic personally, necessary for broader objectives and devastating for individuals. Simultaneously, success and catastrophe depending on which lens examines it. Comfortable answers that resolve this tension are dishonest. The tension is the truth. The legacy of Clervaux battle extends beyond World War II history into broader military education about delay tactics and economy of force operations. Military colleges worldwide study Clervaux as example of how outnumbered defenders can impose disproportionate delays on attackers through professional execution of defensive doctrine. The tactical lessons are timeless. Use terrain advantages, force attackers into unfavorable approach routes, accept casualties to buy time, maintain cohesion under pressure, hold until mission accomplished or force destroyed. These lessons, purchased with American lives in December 1944, continue educating officers who face similar challenges in different contexts. The blood price of those lessons makes them particularly memorable to students who understand that doctrinal abstractions describe real people making impossible choices. The modern traveler to Clervaux finds a prosperous town of roughly 5,000 residents, rebuilt from ruins into pleasant community that shows minimal evidence of its violent past beyond memorials and museums. The castle dominates the landscape as it has for centuries, hosting visitors who come for photography exhibitions and medieval architecture rather than military history. The few battle tourists who arrive find small museum displays in castle lower chambers, photographs of destruction, maps showing defensive positions, brief explanations of what occurred. The presentations are understated, almost apologetic, as if Luxembourg is embarrassed by the violence that occurred here. This understatement actually honors the battle's character better than dramatic presentations might. Clervaux wasn't dramatic. It was professional soldiers doing their jobs under impossible circumstances, dying to accomplish missions they understood as duties rather than heroic quests. The inscription on the memorial in the castle courtyard reads simply, "They held, December 16 through 18, 1944. No elaborate rhetoric about sacrifice or glory, no stirring call to remember fallen heroes, just statement of fact that acknowledges professional competence under pressure." Fuller, who contributed to the memorial's design, insisted on this brevity. He believed that soldiers who'd done their jobs needed no embellishment beyond acknowledgement of that accomplishment. They held. 3 words that contain everything important about the battle: the mission, the execution, the cost. Military professionals reading those 3 words understand volumes about doctrine, leadership, sacrifice. Civilians might need more context, but the memorial wasn't designed for civilians. It was designed for soldiers who would recognize their own potential futures in what those words described. The ultimate judgment on whether Clervaux battle mattered comes from comparing timeline and outcomes. The Ardennes offensive was designed to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours, Antwerp in 7 days. It failed to reach the Meuse at all, was contained within 10 days, and was reversed within a month. The failure resulted not from any single engagement, but from accumulated delays that destroyed the operational timetable. Clervaux was one of multiple delay points, significant but not individually decisive. The composite effect of Clervaux plus St. Vith plus Elsenborn Ridge plus dozen other defensive stands created friction that the German offensive couldn't overcome. Military historians debate relative importance of various delay actions, constructing arguments about which battles were most critical. The debate misses the fundamental point. They were all necessary. Remove any single delay and the timetable improves marginally, but still fails. The offensive required everything to work perfectly. American defenders, fighting at Clervaux and elsewhere, ensured that nothing worked perfectly. That collective resistance, uncoordinated but effective, destroyed German strategic objectives. Fuller's words at the 1954 dedication ceremony captured what the battle ultimately meant. We didn't know we were heroes, we just knew we were soldiers with orders to hold. We held until we couldn't hold anymore. If that mattered, if those hours made a difference somewhere we couldn't see, then the lives we spent there bought something worth their price. If not, they died doing their duty. Either way, they deserve to be remembered for what they were. Professional soldiers who did their jobs when their job was dying. The statement, characteristically blunt, reflected Fuller's understanding that combat's reality resists romantic narratives. Soldiers at Clervaux weren't heroes in conventional sense. They were professionals executing doctrine under extreme circumstances. The heroism, if term applies at all, was in the professionalism itself. The determination to follow orders, support unit cohesion, accomplish mission, despite knowing the personal cost would likely be death. This is unglamorous heroism, the kind that doesn't inspire movies but wins wars through cumulative effect of thousands of soldiers doing their jobs competently. The final assessment, reached through 7 decades of historical analysis, is unambiguous. The Battle of Clervaux mattered strategically while remaining forgotten publicly. This combination of significance and obscurity isn't unusual in military history. Most decisive battles aren't the famous ones, but the unnamed engagements that created conditions for famous victories. Clervaux enabled Bastogne by imposing delays that allowed reinforcement. Bastogne enabled Allied containment of the offensive by anchoring the defensive line. The containment enabled counterattack that destroyed German offensive capability. The chain of causation runs through Clervaux even though public memory stops at Bastogne. For military professionals, this pattern is familiar and acceptable. Significance doesn't require fame. Effectiveness doesn't demand recognition. The battle accomplished its mission. That accomplishment, visible to those trained to see it, is recognition enough. Standing in Clervaux Castle Tower as evening shadows lengthen